He's at an Ward 8 meeting, so hopefully he'll get here as quickly as he can. I'd like to welcome back Alderman Melbourne from his recent escapades with the doctors. I know what that's all about, you know. So glad that you're back.
It was a choice to come back. Right?
Okay. Also in attendance, Tim Cummings, Administrative Services and Economic Development Director, Jill Stansfield, our Parking Manager, and also tonight's special guest, Mr. Andy Hill from Desmond Associates. And I'd like to welcome Alderman Clay. Anybody else that I inadvertently skipped? Seeing nobody? Beautiful. Public comment. We'll open up the meeting to public comment, but seeing nobody in the audience, we'll quickly close the public comment. Communications.
Communication's been received from Wayne Husband, Senior Traffic Engineer, regarding O23-041, authorizing a stop sign at Topaz Drive and Kelly Street intersection.
Okay, before we do that, is without objection that I'm going to suspend the rules to allow that aforementioned communication that was received after the agenda was prepared. Okay, that's the, from Mr. Husband.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. All right, seeing there's no objections, I'll accept the communications and place them on file. Excuse me. Unfinished business?
What is this? What motion are you looking for?
Right here,
Yeah, but what, it's not legislation, what motion are we looking for here?
final passage.
Okay, well, then I will make a motion to recommend final passage regarding a communication from Tim Cummins, Director of Economic Development, on potential new development project for BIDA.
Okay, and I'm going to recognize Director Cummings for a brief explanation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This may actually take a little bit longer of a conversation than you all may want to have at this point in the agenda. I would be happy to have this come at the end of the agenda if it's the committee's pleasure. Otherwise, I'd be happy to speak to it right now. It's relative to a future project that the Business and Industrial Development Authority would like to take on. And before any type of legislation gets filed, I thought it would behoove us to just have this at least initial introductory type of conversation.
It calls up to you. I say we're partially into it. What's the flavor of the board? Do you want to continue or do you want to move it to later on in the agenda? Alderman Clemens.
I would prefer, since we have our guests and employees here, to move that later on and try to get through.
Duly noted. Okay, if everybody's in agreement and without objection, we'll move the, if Alderman Como can temporarily withdraw your motion.
Sure, I would love nothing more.
And we'll move that to a later into the agenda. Okay. Petitions.
There are none.
New business resolutions.
There are none.
New business ordinances.
Before us is O23-041, authorizing a stop sign on Topaz Drive at its intersection with Kelly Street. I'd like to make a motion to recommend final passage.
Okay, any discussion on the motion? Part of your agenda, you did get the report from Mr. Husband. And there's no objections to the stop sign. Okay, seeing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next motion.
Before us is O23-042, allowing leases for spaces in the Water Street parking lot. I'd like to make a motion to recommend final passage.
Director Cummings, do you want to?
Yeah, happy to speak to this if you'd like, Mr. Chairman. So what this legislation does is it allows for leases to be able to be entered into in the Water Street parking lot. Technically, right now, that is not authorized by ordinance. What's necessitating this is a local business in the downtown, specifically a restaurant, has approached the city and under a separate piece of legislation has asked us to enter into a lease agreement for one parking space in the Water Street lot so they can use it for their refuse collection and disposal. This is not uncommon in an urbanized area in the downtown where certain buildings were built out with complete lot coverage, and so therefore you can't necessarily have the typical type of things you might see elsewhere, such as a dumpster enclosed on the particular property. And so this was a creative solution that we came up with over time, because we looked at a few other options, and this turned out to be the best when we met with all the various stakeholders to vet the idea and concept of trying to solve this problem for everyone's mutual benefit. Ultimately, it was settled upon that a parking spot in the Water Street lot made the most sense, as opposed to looking at doing something on the right-of-way or underneath the overpass because of various concerns such as fire or site distances that, DPW, fire department, police all had when we brought everyone into the conversation. So that is specifically the lease at hand that's in the Finance Committee, but what's necessitating it, and again, the ordinance that's before you, is a piece of legislation just to allow us to enter into that lease agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Cummings. Any discussion by members of the committee? Seeing none, call for a vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Tabled in committee.
There is none.
Okay, we'll lead into discussion, and at this time I'd like to welcome Mr. Andy Hill of Desmond Associates, and he's going to do a presentation on the parking study today. So, welcome, Mr. Hill.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. What I want to do this evening is take you through the first two phases of the work. We've completed our work to date. It is a rather voluminous body of work at this point in time. And in discussion with Tim Cummings and Jill Stansfield, we thought that it would be best to present this in a couple of manageable pieces rather than a single omnibus, if you will. So there are, for those of you who remember back to when we initially started this work, 5 distinct phases of work. As you can see up on the screen, we'll be covering the first 3 phases this evening. For some of you, this will be a rehash of information that you've seen before. For some of you, this will be new information. So I will try and go as quickly as I can to appease the first and as thoroughly as I can to address the second. We did a very extensive bit of stakeholder engagement as part of this. Parking is the lifeblood of any downtown, and we wanted to make sure that we were engaging the community and giving them multiple avenues in order to have input during the process. That included the working group that you've seen up on the screen here, who has been our tireless advisors through this entire process, helping us with everything from defining the study area at the outset to identifying emerging developments as we started to talk about future conditions, to vetting the early draft work products as we've gone along here. In addition to those folks, we engaged in over 60 hours of directed meetings with different interest groups, including these 2 committees here, as we had worked through the initial due diligence and early phases of the study. There were thousands of comments that came out of these stakeholder meetings. Some of the general themes that we heard as we were going through these included a constant concern about safety, both in the parking facilities themselves as well as on the street. When we spoke with property owners, they indicated that one of the biggest challenges they had to deal with was finding adequate parking to secure leases in property that they had downtown. We heard a lot of concerns about what was going to happen with what was termed at the time the School Street program, which I now believe is the Flats. The Performing Arts Center, which I believe is opening shortly. And at the time, what was a fairly new outdoor dining program. Over and over again, we heard that whatever solutions we brought to the table needed to preserve the existing culture, but move the city toward its goals of sustainability. We've tried to do our best to bring that to the table, and you'll hear some of that this evening as we go along. And you will also hear the theme over and over again, that there was a lot of concern and a lot of interest in coming up with solutions or new ideas surrounding overnight parking. And there was a lot of concern with regards to how the city handled snow emergencies, specifically as it impacted parking. And we'll talk about that this evening as well. Part of what we did at the initial outset of this study was a fairly extensive surveying effort here. We received over 1,000 responses, I believe, when we did the calculations relative to the most recent US Census. It was 11.5% share sample of total population credited to the city of Nashua here. It was a little bit heavier on the female than the male side here. According to US Census, that's about a 50-50 split. We were about 10% heavier there, but the way the age distribution was roughly proportionate to the population. 92% of those folks who responded indicated they drove themselves downtown, and 66% indicated that they were visiting downtown at least once a week. And it was a fairly good cross-section of users, and it drew voices not only from Nashua, but also the surrounding municipalities that come in and out of Nashua to conduct business. One of the things that we asked was that folks identify both their primary reason or the main reason they come downtown as well as secondary. 80% of the respondents indicated themselves to be diners, and roughly 50% indicated that one of the main reasons they came into downtown was to either shop or patronize a business. Special events were also a primary reason for coming downtown on a regular basis. So there was a significant representation of residents and employees, but also good representation of what we would refer to as transient users. Transient parkers are an important consideration because those are the folks who will come downtown and have a single experience and form an opinion on that. So one of the things that we had to be cognizant of with our recommendations is how to make sure that those folks were accommodated. Oh, there we go. So just top of the waves, some of the takeaways that we had with regards to residents, 76% indicated that they had their parking needs partially or completely met. 62% said that they did that for free. Employees said that 61% indicated they had parking employed by their employer, and 65% at no cost to themselves. Almost 2/3 indicated that they usually park for 2 hours or less, and 83% indicated they could usually find parking in under 10 minutes. Slightly less than half said they could usually find parking under 5 minutes. One of the biggest concerns that we often hear from municipalities is if folks could not find parking within what they deem to be reasonable walking distance of their destination, that they would go somewhere else. The good news is for downtown Nashua, the attraction is such that 3 out of 4 respondents indicated that if they couldn't find parking immediately, they would circle the block, search the immediate area until they found a space close to their destination. So it refuted some of the concern that we had heard in the past that folks will just go elsewhere. They will persevere because of the attraction, or at least 3/4 of them will persevere based on the attraction that is offered in downtown Nashua. That said, the two biggest concerns we heard over and over again were proximity to destination, security. Those two things were very much hand in glove linked together. Folks equated proximity with security to some degree because of the lesser distance they had to cover from wherever they were parked to their ultimate destination. This also echoed back the concerns that we had early on in the process from the stakeholders about perceived safety, not only in the parking facilities, but also in these streets connecting them to main destinations. Interestingly enough, and I'll ask you to keep this in mind as we move forward, cost was among the lowest concerns that folks expressed in terms of parking. And again, echoing personal sense of safety and security and condition of sidewalks were the two biggest issues, citing acceptable walking distance. Now, acceptable walking distance for parking is a major concern because the biggest issue you often see is a disconnect between what is expectation and what is reality. We tried to drill down on this by asking two different questions at two different points during the survey. The first question was, how far away are you willing to park? That set expectation. And then later on, we asked folks, how close do you typically park? That actually set experience. As you can see on the chart above here, for the most part, expectation, which is represented in yellow, versus experience, which is represented in blue, is a very positive and favorable relationship here. It is not until you start getting into distances of 2 blocks away or more that you start to see that the yellow bars actually outstrip the blue bars. So for the most part, folks not only are finding parking within their expectation as they come downtown, but they're finding parking, more folks are finding parking closer to their destination than their expectation when they come into downtown. Other comments that we had pulled out of this that bore consideration, especially as we went through the process, probably the biggest one I want you to hold in the back of your mind right now is when we asked folks typically where they like to park, only 15% of the respondents, that's 15% of the respondents indicated they parked in a private facility. As you'll see in a minute, when we start talking about the distribution of supply downtown, there's a significant disconnect between where people tend to park and where the availability of parking is in downtown. Only 1 in 5 respondents indicated, again, that they would leave and go elsewhere if they couldn't find parking within a reasonable time in their distance. So again, says a lot about the attraction that is provided here in downtown Nashua to have that type of consistency and interest in making things work. We talked a little bit about some of the different concerns. One of the things we were asked to do was take a look at wayfinding. As a general rule, the wayfinding system as it exists right now is adequate to more than adequate in most cases here. In terms of evaluation by the individuals taking this, it was evaluated as passable to 70% rated downtown wayfinding as passable to very poor. So only 30% rated it as passable to excellent here. And then one of the questions that we were asked was how big a concern should we have about electric vehicles? When we polled individuals, only 13% indicated they were planning to purchase an electric vehicle in the next 5 years. 19% said they weren't sure. Now that said, electric vehicle charging is going to become an increasing issue out over the next 20 years. Right now in America, there's 1 public charging station for every 28 electrical vehicles requiring charging out on the road today. That gap is expected to expand drastically as we start to see more and more manufacturers start to push more and more EV products out on the road. I think by 2035, General Motors has indicated that at least 40% of the fleet they expect to turn out each year to be completely electrical chargeable vehicles. One of the things that we asked folks to do was is to, in one or more words, indicate the greatest challenges that they saw to the downtown parking environment. This was organized into a graphic that you see up on the screen called a word cloud. The bigger the word is that shows up on the screen, the more respondents identified that as a major concern or challenge to downtown parking. The one that I actually want to draw your attention to is the overnight parking that's highlighted on the screen. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring your attention to that is that was a course of study that occurred before this project was actually initiated. We were brought in to do an independent course of study on the overnight parking policy and overnight parking programs here in January through June of 2020, before we started this work here. Or actually 2021, pardon me. Just gives you a little bit of background on where, how this came to be an issue here, specifically COVID-19 and the changes that it may had on working trends and commuting trends really brought this into sharp relief. And as we were waiting to initiate this body of work until COVID had passed here, we had an opportunity early in 2021 to study this issue when it was still red hot in front of the community here. And based on everything that we've heard through stakeholder engagements and surveys, continues to be a major consideration today. As part of that initial effort, we conducted well over 60 hours worth of public meetings to draw out feedback and information from residents of all the different wards. In several cases, we actually went back to different wards multiple occasions to test ideas out on them, ask them for more information or more feedback. What we learned from this process, one, was there was no universal consensus on whether this policy should be changed across the city. It very much depended on what ward you were in. It was very clear to us from talking to city staff as well as residents, any change in policy has to protect the right-of-way of municipal emergency and service vehicles. So whatever we had to come up with had to acknowledge that and find a way to protect that. Any program that we were going to advance forward had to benefit residents, not commercial vehicles, landlords, or businesses. So that had to be the focus, which caused us to start really thinking about this in terms of a residential parking permit program rather than just an overnight parking program. One of the things that the city struggles with and is going to continue to struggle with going forward is simple geometrics. Nashua is a post-colonial era city that was laid out at a time where the primary mode of transit were horse and buggies. As a result, the geometrics, the width of your streets, the amount of allowable room you have curb to curb can be very limited and constrained at certain places, which makes setting forth any type of on-street parking program rather challenging because you can't guarantee that everybody is going to have a space right in front of their house. In fact, in some roadways where we found this practice occurring right now, geometrically speaking, it probably shouldn't be in order to preserve right-of-way and safe parking along the curb. Like I said, where we did find a lot of interest in this, it was very much proportionate to residential density in the particular wards. One of the things that became abundantly clear to us, not only from talking to stakeholders, but also from doing research into the residential parking permit programs that really work out there, is the only way a program works is with the fully informed consent and impact of the populace. Any program that is done without that is almost assuredly doomed to fail. And if you're looking for a program that has really succeeded along those lines, You don't need to look much further than Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who has also been going down this road and has done an exemplary job of engaging with the populace, informing the populace, and keeping the populace engaged as they have gone through their various pilots to see if this is a road they wanted to pursue. The reason that residential parking is so difficult to manage is something referred to in economics as the tragedy of the commons. And the simplest way to put this is whenever you have a public good that is out there and available to the general public, if there's not a reasonable form of regulation on it and some way to fairly and equitably apportion it out, you will find it inequitably apportioned out and very quickly exhausted. The tragedy of commons actually comes from a study done of common grazing grounds in England here and how those got grazed out into extinction here. But one of my favorite examples on the upper right-hand side is a editorial cartoon which indicates a bunch of people stuck in traffic saying, if all of these other people were to take mass transit, I could be home by now. So let's talk about what really makes a good residential parking program. And there are just some very common elements to this. Element number one is that they are localized and very much collaborative with the impacted constituents. Again, they only work if the impacted constituents are engaged at the get-go, and they typically only work on a very limited geometric footprint. The programs that typically don't work are the ones that are done on a very broad footprint because you're going to have different needs in different neighborhoods, different wards. In fact, case in point, you may actually have different needs from street to street here. If these programs are going to work, they have to be data-driven, which means that you need to set metrics to achieve performance at the outset, track those metrics, and then report them back to the constituency so that they understand how the program is working and that the program is, in point of fact, working as designed. That said, while these programs have to benefit residents, you have to include allowances for guests and occasional commercial activity. If you don't make allowances for that, the program is likely to fail because everybody's going to have guests at some point and everybody's going to have their plumbing fixed or their housing, their siding done or their roofing done, something along those lines. So you need to make allowances for that. Again, these can only work if you can acknowledge the geometric restraints, that is there space to accommodate curbside parking in this particular area, and how much parking in this area can you accommodate given the geometrics, and also the operational restraints. This speaks again to the need to maintain right-of-way for emergency and service vehicles coming in and out of the area. The best programs balance supply and demand, either through prescription, that's limiting the number of permits per household so that there's a reasonable balance between supply and demand, or through pricing, which basically sets pricing in a manner or in a way that the individuals limit the number of permits that they purchase to achieve a balance between supply and demand. You also need rigorous enforcement to make these programs work, and ideally, once you've got a program established, you're still performing periodic review and ratification to make sure that the program is still working 3-4 years down the line and there's still general support within the community. In order to get an idea for what these programs might look like and where they have worked or they haven't worked, we looked at a number of different communities and benchmarked against them, looking at them, some of them as aspirational, some of them as truly comparable here. This gives you an idea of the general cross-section of what we looked at. And one of the first things we did was we looked at what their dimensional standards are. Again, this goes back to the question of geometrics. And what are the setbacks that you have to impose in order to maintain that clear right-of-way for emergency vehicles and service vehicles? What we came up with was an initial prescription on what those geometrics should be here in the city of Nashua. This is critical because when you talk about studying an area and trying to establish whether you should allow overnight parking, one of the biggest questions you've got to answer before you even go down that road is how much parking can we make available versus the number of people who might be interested in it. Answering the first requires defining the geometrics to figure out what's your available capacity within a defined area. What we provided in the deliverable we gave to the city were these recommended geometrics to help ferret that process along and help with that definition. Again, one of the things that we heard was that these programs need to maintain equitability between all users, and they need to maintain safety and service here. Keeping that in mind, we came up with a set of 8 proposed core rules for any type of establishment of an RPP in Nashua. These include things like a requirement within a recognized residential parking permit zone for individuals who have a permit to still remove their roadway on designated trash pickup days and seek alternative accommodations off-road. Ideally, these would be clearly scheduled and clearly communicated ahead of time here, allowing folks for time to pursue alternate accommodations, but these programs could only work with trash pickup as it is occurring right now in Nashua if those streets are cleared for that service to happen here. Ditto during snow emergencies and snow removal and street cleaning here. Those streets have to be cleared during those events in order to make any program like this viable. The model that we had come up with and that we had recommended was a model that started with a petition process originated by a neighborhood looking to establish a residential parking program. It would require those neighbors to go out, gather enough signatures to indicate there was a majority interest in establishing this, and then file a formal application for recognition as a potential RPP. If they could find adequate support for that and adequate petitions in order to move that forward, then the next step would be a capacity test to establish how much capacity there was in the proposed RPP zone. Once that was established, then they would be asked to go out and verify, based on the capacity testing and the number of households interested in participating, that this would basically be a 1-to-1 ratio, a 1-to-2 ratio, whatever the capacity allowed relative to the number of households interested in participating, and confirm that there was still support for this. If there was support for this, then they would be required to engage with the city, specifically, most likely the parking department, to establish what the costs would be associated to establish this, signage, paint, etc. And that would all roll into a calculation of what the annual rate would be for the permit in order to make this a revenue neutral program. If that was still agreeable, at this point, the application could go forward for recognition, ratification, and implementation, be implemented and executed, and then every 5 years would be subject to a recertification process, which would be a simple petition program, again, to confirm that there was still majority support within this area to make this go forward. Now, this was the program that we recommended based on best principles and best practices. Is it the program that you have to go by? Absolutely not. What we wanted to provide was a program that at least gave the city of Nashua a land map and a footprint to start. I've included some frequently asked questions here that have come up in the wake of this. Some of these questions came from policymakers, some of them came from individuals. But there are a lot of ways you can set up and structure this program. This is just one model. The critical thing is getting whatever you're going to get set up, moving forward and ratified in the near future, because this continues to be a matter of great concern and great interest. And I know that we were kind of hoping to hold questions to the end, but I think this is probably a good time to pause and invite questions or comment. I see a number of you shaking your heads or raising your eyebrows, and so I think this may be a good time to pause and hear from you.
We do have one from Alderman Wilshire.
Thank you. I apologize for arriving late. This is only a snapshot of what the actual study is, correct? I mean, what you handed out here is...
Yes, ma'am. This is just a PowerPoint that covers a
Okay.
document that's currently over 300 pages long.
300 pages,
Yeah.
okay. All right, very good. I'm sorry I was late and didn't get that. Appreciate it.
And I also would like to welcome Alderman Wilshire and Alderman Theobald, who have joined the meeting. Any other questions? Alderman Clegg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've gone to, I think, almost all of the meetings, if not all of them, and I appreciate everything that you've done. My biggest concern is that the two wards I think that are mostly impact are wards 3 and 4. I think 7 and possibly even 6 may have a little bit of impact in them, but 3 and 4 is going to do this. And my concern is, even currently, I'm glad you mentioned about grandfathering people in and so on. You mentioned about the metrics to try to do that, and I know that's really getting into the weeds. I'm not going to ask you that, but my concern is that in order to do something like this, we're going to need to increase staff. We're going to, and trust me, I want to get Jill as much staff as possible, as much as we could afford, but I foresee, and I'm going to take a street that seems very like Summer Street in my ward. It's very wide, and it seems like it should be able to have adequate parking. But the way houses are built is they're built with driveways so that you don't back into somebody else's driveway. They're kind of, and that means that no one can park across from a driveway. They can't park within 2 feet. So the general public is going to say, well, I got a nice wide, I should be able to have it, because they don't understand that all those ordinances that are stopping things that are happening. You said something about doing a kind of a, I don't want to say survey, actually going in and seeing what you have for inventory of parking. Are you going to stick to just the downtown area? Are you going to go into other areas such as like my area, French Hill and so on? I know that when you redid your you redid 3 wards when you redid it, 3, 7, and 4, I think it was, correct? Yeah. So will you be really going into there to do inventory, or are you going to do inventory for the entire city? Because I know Ward 5 probably doesn't want to have overnight parking or even on-street parking, and
Well,
my
this-
ward is going to want it.
This goes back to the principle of having the process start with the constituents. So I'm not going to do anything.
I know you're not.
Ideally, the city is not going to do anything. You would ask the constituents to come together first and identify an area that they have interest in seeing the establishment of an area for a residential parking permit program. And then somebody, most likely from DPW, would have to go through, take a look at the geometrics and establish what the capacity in that area is first, and report back to that interested party to say, listen, within the area that you've defined, you have 100 parking spaces and you have 100 families that are interested in participating with this. Are you okay with the idea that we're only going to be able to offer 1 permit per household? And is that acceptable to you?
May I just quickly follow up?
Follow up?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, and I know we've talked about that in the past, and as a precursor to all of this, even a year ago, I was talking to my constituents, and I had little meetings as to where they were going to need it. And I can tell you that the areas that wanted it most are probably going to have the least amount of inventory. Locke Street, Whitney Street, Granite Street, Summer Street, all of those areas that want it. Because as you pointed out, when homes were built, it was horse and buggy, so they didn't have garages, they didn't have anything more than a one single driveway. So, and I'm saying this as much for us as the general public, just because we've done this study and we're doing this doesn't mean that suddenly all these parking spaces are going to become free. Because when I look at something like Whitney Street where we've already got parking, I see fire issues. We can't even use regular plows to plow those streets. We have to use the Park and Recs plows because they're much too narrow and so on. So my concern is that the general public is gonna hear that we have this and they're going to say, okay, Jill Stanfield or Public Works or whoever's gonna start counting parking spaces because we all want it. And trust me, they do all want it. But the ones that really need it, the more dense homes, are the ones that aren't gonna be able to have it. And this is breaking my heart. So, thank you.
Alderman Clemmons.
Yeah, thank you very much. The issue that I have is the proposed process. I think it's convoluted, and I think it doesn't take into account the fact that most of the people who need that type of parking are renters who don't necessarily own the property that they live in and may not be living there for the entire time that it would take to go through a petition process like this. So to me, this is a job that is incumbent upon the city to do. We are elected officials. We know that there is a problem out there where people need to park overnight. And to me, we need to solve that problem. We were elected to solve that problem, not to throw it back on the citizens and say, well, you figure it out. So that's my problem with this. I feel like I was elected to serve our constituents, not to throw the process back onto them. That's why they put me here. And so I have a problem with that process because to me, we should be identifying the streets that we can do this on and then go and do it. Decide what the fee is gonna be, decide how many people per household is gonna be able to do it, and then do it.
Well, in follow-up to what Alderman Clemmons said, was your intention to be tenants only or to the landlords themselves? They have an equal say as far as petitioning and bringing it forward.
Ideally, because we're focused on residents, that would translate into tenants only, not to landlords unless they were actually living on property. If it was an owner-occupied property here, then they would basically identify as residents within that particular area or district.
Yeah, Alderman Clay.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. And one of the comments that you made was this was to benefit the residents and not landlords and not businesses. The issue that I'm going to have is, again, I will bring up French Hill and even over towards Franklin where they've got a lot of renters. Some of these people are only going to live there 1 year. We can set that every year they have to redo it. That's not quite as much my issue as a 5-year. But my concern is that I'm going to speak specifically to one particular unit on Locke Street where they rented out the place and said to the renter, they've got overnight parking on such and such a street. They didn't give parking. So they rented it with this, and Jill will tell you that there was no parking permit for people on Locke Street. Even though right around the corner there was overnight parking, that particular person couldn't park there. So my fear is that landlords are going to use this as their alternate parking. They don't have enough parking there, and they're gonna count it in as their 1.5 per unit or whatever the criteria is. So I have a lot of, I don't wanna say transient people, but people who rent in my area, and I do foresee something like that happening. Would it be prohibitive to say that every year, or would this just be so much work that not a 5-year? Don't give them 5-year permit that every year they have to kind of reapply to make sure that the same people are there.
So you're asking, once you've established an RPP, do you have to go through the process of re-ratifying that RPP on an annual basis? Or are you asking, are you requiring the folks who have a permit to re-register on an annual basis?
Okay, yeah, do you mind if I clarify,
Go
Mike?
ahead.
Thank you so much. So yes, I understand what you're saying is that the residential group will say, we'll allow for 10 parking spaces, but what you did was you said that resident 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 can do it, but if 5 is a renter, and now they're not there, do you automatically give it to the next renter? That's kind of what I'm saying. So that's why I thought that maybe you can set up this for 5 years, but that the people who get the permit have to do it on an annual basis.
Yes,
Does that make clear?
and that's a best practice, that folks
Okay.
have to re-register on an annualized basis.
Okay.
So as you have folks move out and others move in, that you're not carrying permits for folks, you're not carrying permits within the inventory for folks who've already left and are no longer part of that area.
If I make just one more quick question. Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm really just trying to understand this and for the people listening, but, so if, say, number 5 moved out, would that permit still stay with the number 5, or, in other words, so they sold the house, I'm not even gonna say it's renters, they've sold the house, so would they still get it, or is it now up for grabs? So if resident number 6 wanted to apply for it, they could apply for it?
So if you had somebody who was living in a property who had moved out of that property, whether they had sold it, whether they're a renter and they moved somewhere else, at the annual re-registration, whether that's January 1st, et cetera, of that year, everybody who wanted a permit would be required to go through the registration process again, which included demonstrating residency. The permit that was held for resident number 5 would automatically expire on December 31st.
Okay.
And resident 6 would have the ability to go in and apply for a permit if they meet the criteria to get the permit.
Thank you for
Yeah,
indulging me.
and not
I
to
appreciate it.
reinvent the wheel, but this is happening in Cambridge and a whole host of others. People are moving out
Yes,
and
Yeah. This
you
is-
have to
this is-
re-register.
yes.
The chair does have a concern or a question.
Yeah.
I am really afraid that we're gonna bite too big of an apple here in opening this up. And so, what your recommendation is to look at wards first and maybe start work in one area. And once we get the monster built, I think we'll be able to apply that blueprint to other places within the city. What would be your recommendations along those lines?
Well, yeah, in reference to your question, and also in reference to Alderman Clemens' statement here, I'd like to direct your attention to the second Q&A under FAQs here, which asks, can't we create a more standardized program? And the answer is yes. What we have provided is a model for a program. It is a model based on best practices and best interests. If this body decides to take pieces of that model and move forward and, but modify that to make it work more appropriately for the city of Nashua, including establishing it in one ward initially as a test pilot,
Yeah.
and then working through the kinks and seeing if it applies to, other wards along those lines. There's certainly a blueprint for that. Again, I would direct you to Portsmouth. I would direct you to Albany, New York. Both of them started along this lines, where you had a group of citizens who said, we're interested in this. A body, I don't know if it was the Board of Aldermen, the City Council, or another body, took the initiative to establish an initial pilot area, establish the rules within that pilot, communicate out to the general public to confirm, acceptance of those rules, and also determine the number of permits that would be allowable issued within that area and the basis for how those permits would be circulated equitably here. And that's certainly another model you can look at going forward. This evening, I guess, having spent a year and a half talking to your constituents, the one thing that I wanted to hammer home is whatever you decide to do really needs to happen within the next year, based on the temper of the comments that have been directed my way, as well as the projection of what future conditions are going to look like in a year or two with the number of emerging developments that you have in the pipeline.
Okay, Alderman Clemmons has a question.
Well, it's more of a comment, and the comment is that we have this in place. We have a pilot program in place. We have something that we can follow
Well,
already in place.
I would be very cautious in that nomenclature equally as well, because I think what we may find out of what started in the normal permit program by the new rules that were guidelines that are proposed, that may go away on some of the streets.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I don't think that we should be taking parking away from anywhere
No,
that
but
exists
I want you to
now.
understand, it's apples, I just want to clearly state, because I can see the legalities coming down the pike. I'm not saying we can't allow a grandfathering. All I'm just saying, you can't, this is not going to mirror what we had
But
done, and
can I
that's why we
finish?
paid for this particular
Can I finish
study.
my comments, Mr. Chairman?
You absolutely may, but I hope you understand what I was trying to get.
I do, and I understand what you're saying, and I saw the slide that we all saw about the dimensions and how far apart and everything else that things need to be, but my point is that where parking on the street exists, it would be my opinion and my hope that where parking exists now, we would grandfather that in. And as we look out, we would take this study and go to other streets. The only thing that I would point out there is to say that the program and the way that the program works is very similar to what's being said here. And we can take that program and just expand it. Yes, the requirements for how we have to do it and where it doesn't exist now and how many per street and all of that, yeah, I agree. But I hope that this body would not be thinking about taking away parking that exists currently and changing it. Going forward, moving out from where it is, absolutely we should follow this study. I don't disagree with that. But I'm saying the program itself, we have a program, at least as far as the way it exists, where people have to go and they have to apply and all of that stuff. And so my hope is we can take what we have and expand it.
And for the record, I do agree, and I'm not against grandfathering. I'm just saying we can't take what was the past.
No, right.
You know, we're going to be having a new sheriff in town with this idea. Okay, Director Cummings.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this specific conversation that we're having this evening is a good one. I think it should continue, but it's only one part of what we're trying to discuss this evening. We're on slide 24. I think there's over 70 slides. So what I would ask, Mr. Chairman, is, if we could table this conversation, and I'd be happy to come back another night specifically to focus on this overnight parking conversation, because it's one that I know everyone wants to continue to have.
Yeah, and not against, but we do have one question pending, and that is from Alderman Jettie, that I think he...
Oh, thank you. I don't want to, take up everyone's time. On the slide, I think it's the one you have here. Yeah, the third question down, you talk about a guest pass system. Could you explain that more? I'm in Ward 5, which I don't know if you recall the meeting that we had. There weren't many. I think only 2 people showed up to talk about it, and one person was against parking. Another person has been asking for parking for years. So, for example, there's a street it's a dead-end street. There are 2 houses on it. And, both people agree they'd like to, they've got kids, more cars than they've got parking driveway space. They want to park on the street at night. And so is there a way that, and there are no curbs, there are no sidewalks. It's a pretty rural area. And, I don't, personally, I don't see why we couldn't, allow, that section of the street, if everybody on the street agrees, to allow overnight parking except during snow emergencies and, restrictions for, trash pickup and all that stuff. But, is that what you're talking about? Is, when you talk about this guest pass system, they'd like to, park all the time and not have to request like they can now, they can call and they say, I need to park there tonight, and our parking department is very generous in allowing that. But, is there anything wrong, with our saying, okay, on this particular street, overnight parking is allowed?
If you can reach consensus for support with all of the stakeholders that live on that street, then within the model that I proposed, no, there's nothing wrong with that. If there's general consensus and support for that to establish such a program, no. And if you're talking about a dead-end street that has adequate geometrics to support that, and they agree to the core rules, then no, I don't see a problem with that.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Hill, if I may interrupt, Ms. Stanfield, this might be a perfect segue into bring up what happens when, as existing law now, if somebody has guests, we do have a procedure for that, correct?
Yes, we do.
And if you want to pass that number out, this is your opportunity.
Yes, so folks can either call our office, the 603-589-3077, and leave their vehicle information, how many nights they need. Or they can visit the website as well, which is nashuanh.gov/parking. And they can click on overnight parking and they can fill out a form, or they can even just send us an email to our email address, which is parking@nashuanh.gov.
And I think this is what, those that you have listened to me in the past, I said, there's a lot of moving parts of this. I think you're starting to see it now. It's going to take a while to implement this. Director Cummings, I think under his advice, I don't think we really should get tied up on one particular subject matter. We got Mr. Hill here, who will give us the whole presentation. And then I think as we march down, come to a solution with this, we're going to have to parcel it up. It's going to be a lot of work. So keeping that in mind, and is that what direction you were going, Director Cummings?
Yes.
So let's continue it instead of getting hung up on one particular subject. I'm not against the comments on it, but, just keep in mind, it may be the wrong venue to focus on it at this particular time, putting the cart before the horse. So, carry on, Mr. Hill.
If I may,
You may.
it would be my suggestion as your consultant in this particular area, that I certainly understand the need and interest to table this matter, but it would reflect positively on this body and show forward movement if you were to establish a date and time at some point in the future, specifically to delve deeper into this matter. And to support that, I would be willing to volunteer my time pro bono to advise that body in order to move this policy forward.
You just spoke music to my ears. But is this the end of your presentation?
This is not, but before.
Okay, that's what I was the chair was referring to. If you have more of the presentation, please carry on. And then I'm going to take you up on your offer as we move down in the future.
I just wanted to make sure that was on record.
Thank you, and it's a gracious offer. I thank you so much.
So I think we've beaten this horse to death, so we will move along to existing conditions here. Just top of the waves, the study area that we looked at was 108 total blocks made up of 6 different distinct regions or areas within what was identified as the downtown. This was established through negotiations with the city, as well as conversations with that working group that I had identified earlier on. Within this area, there are, at any given time, over 13,000 parking spaces, and that will fluctuate up and down according to the outdoor dining program, according to construction projects that were going on at the time. So you'll see those numbers change slightly according to those. The biggest takeaway to keep in mind is, remember how I pointed out that only 15% of the population indicated that they parked in private parking facilities on a regular basis? I'd like to draw your attention to the 71% that's circled up there. That is the percentage of the parking, of those 13,000 parking spaces that are held in private parking facilities. So if 85% of the respondents to the survey are indicating they prefer to park in public parking facilities, but 70% of your spaces are in private parking facilities, you can understand how there might be a disconnect between practice and inventory moving forward here. And one of the challenges that we're going to have to address is how to open up and make that private inventory more effectively utilized if we're going to balance supply and demand across all those different spaces here. On-street parking, which is the most popular parking, based on utilization here, only represents, again, about 14% of that total supply. People will be surprised to find out that about 32% of the on-street parking in the study area is unregulated. There's no time limit on it. There's no requirement for any type of permit to use it here. The only restriction in place at the time is right now, based on your ordinances, a 48-hour restriction on leaving a vehicle unmoved in any one particular space. Which, by the way, is in conflict with the NHRSA's under 262, which calls for 24 hours, if I'm not mistaken. But we'll burn that bridge down in a minute as well. In terms of public off-street, the amount that is held by the city and available for use in general public is only about 15% of the total supply. Again, a smaller percentage here. The vast majority of this is contained in public lots or public garages. The largest concentrations are in the Elm Street and the High Street garages. And then when you talk about the private off-street parking supply, you're talking about over 9,300 parking spaces. 31% of these, by the way, are owned by one of 2 private entities, either BAE Systems or Southern New Hampshire Medical Center. When we took a look at occupancy, we went out and we did several different series of samplings, including some in October of 2021, as well as April of 2022 here. As a general rule, what we found was that supply outstripped demand on both weekdays and weekends. We looked at both daytime and evening conditions. This is illustrated in the figure that you see above. We also heat mapped utilization across the study of the area. You'll see examples of this in the upper right-hand corner. This basically gives us an idea of which areas or which blocks saw higher levels of utilization. Those that you see in the orange, yellow, or red tend to be 70 to 80% utilized, 80 to 90, or in the red, 90% or higher utilized. Everything in the green is less than 70% utilized in aggregate. Now, within this area, there were some block faces that we noted that were parked over straight capacity. some block faces that we noted that were parked at 85% to 100% capacity. The reason that this is notable is within the parking industry, anything over 85% utilization is considered effectively full, even though there may be a few available or open spaces there. For on-street parking, this has a significant impact because once you see a block face that's 85% full, it is often indicative of a block face that needs some sort of additional regulation in order to balance supply and demand and redistribute that demand onto other available block faces in the area. On weekends, again, you could see through heat mapping that the demand spread away from the Main Street core and some of the more intensive office or business segments and into the residential districts. Again, you have isolated areas where you have extremely high utilization surrounded by areas where you have comparatively low utilization, which results in the aggregate results that you saw in the earlier bar chart here, along with particular block faces or particular facilities that were seeing very high utilization. In addition to those surveys, we also did additional surveys up and down Main Street, using that as a sample to evaluate compliance with posted time limits and length of stay here, as well as compliance. And what you'll notice here is looking at the length of Main Street, and we did this, I believe, on the Friday preceding the 2012 Valentine's Day weekend, which is a very it's an accelerated level of shopping and dining out that you see during the course of the year, so good sample base. We went out every hour on the hour, wrote down the plate number on each plate that was parked up and down Main Street between Franklin Street, Canal, and the Hollis Streets at the far end. And then recorded their length of stay and turnover. What you'll note are the two things I really want you to take away from this that are in the boxes, the red boxes on the right-hand side. Only about 22% of the vehicles that we surveyed were in violation of posted time limits during the course of the day, so a little bit more than 1 in every 5 was overstaying the posted time limit. And about 5% in addition to that were vehicles that were actually being what I refer to as shuffled up and down the street, which is they may be compliant with the posted time limit, but what you've got is somebody who's coming out and moving that vehicle up a couple of spaces and feeding the meter again, or across the street, feeding the meter again. They're in compliant with the posted regulations, but they're flouting the spirit of the regulations, which is to create turnover and availability at those curbside spaces for those transit users that come in, who are discretionary users, who, if they cannot find parking within reasonable proximity to the destination, are likely to go off somewhere else, repeat their experience to others as a negative experience, and therefore hurt the ability to see both repeat users or additional users among discretionary groups.
Mr. Chairman, I hate to interrupt, but that says February 11th, 2012. That can't be right.
That's the weekend.
That's, sorry,
2000.
2022.
No,
That's
it's
correct.
11 and 12.
No, 11 and 12, the weekend.
February 11th and February 12th, not 2012.
Oh, it's 2/11 and 12 of 2022.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, at this point, we do have a clarifying question. If
That was actually gonna be my question as well. I was curious if we were looking at 11-year-old data.
No, we're not,
Thank
you're
you.
looking at bad proofing, that's what you're looking at.
carry on.
Should be
Thank
an
you.
and instead of a slash.
Again, this is another variation on what we looked at. The majority of the parking through this area is Zone 1 metered parking, which has a 90-minute limitation. So where you see the red box, these are all of the vehicles that were parked over 90 minutes during the course of this observation, which started at 8 o'clock in the morning, concluded at 8 o'clock at night. With the longest stay being 2 of the vehicles that we identified that had actually stayed for 9 hours on Temple Street, just off of Main Street, and just never moved. This to us says a number of different things. It says, one, we have an enforcement problem. If we're finding this number of violators, and especially violators who are staying this long, we're not getting enough regular cycles of patrols out there in order to detect and deter this behavior. 2, we need to potentially look at the fines that we're assessing in order to deter or defer this behavior, because it could be that we're just not getting enough patrols out there to catch these folks and ticket it, or the tickets may not be stringent enough to turn down these behaviors. The third option that is available is that we may need to take a look at what we're charging for metered parking in this area, because that is part of what is supposed to prohibit overstay length. Even if the fine doesn't hit you, the accumulating cost should hit you here. So for us, it raised 3 different flags and 3 different things that we needed to look at going forward. Overall, like I said, I think I've covered most of these summaries at this point in time here, and some of the different things that we had taken away from these observations. I talked a little bit about number of blocks where we're seeing 85 to 100% or over 100% utilization. We went back and we looked at each one of these block faces. There were over 40 of them in total. And we took a look at what the regulation was at the time, and our suggestion was to essentially escalate whatever the existing regulation is up to the next regulation in order to cut down on either over parking or extremely high utilization, the idea of wanting to balance supply and demand here. So you can sort of see the hierarchy of regulation that you've got here in the city right now. It starts all the way down on the lower left-hand side with unrestricted parking. It goes all the way up on the upper right-hand side to the Zone 1 meters, which are $1 an hour with a 90-minute time limit. And as you'll see on this slide here, these are all of the block faces that we had identified that for the most part were running at, all were running at 85% to 100% plus in terms of utilization. With a couple of exceptions. I want to point out the section of High Street between Main and Walnut, the section on School Street between Walnut and High, and the section on Central Street between Myrtle and Pine. These were unique because these are both 15-minute timed parking areas that were completely underutilized at a time where all of the on-street parking in and around the area was highly utilized. In the case of Central Street here, those spaces were unutilized at that time because the apartment project that was ongoing there was in process, and those spaces were actually sectioned off at that time. But the anticipation is once that project was over, those areas would go back to a very high level of utilization. And our recommendations were to, like I said, look at, in most cases, escalating whatever the existing regulation is up to the next level of regulation in order to reduce some of that utilization supply and change some of the supply and demand dynamics here. In the case of the 2 15-minute zones that I identified, our recommendation was actually to look at converting those over into metered parking zones in order to, 1, make those more available to the general public, 2, easier to enforce, and 3, hopefully improve the level of utilization that you were looking at those areas. Because like I said, in the entire downtown area, these were the only places, because of the 15-minute time limit, that people weren't parking. Any questions on this? Okay. Some of the other recommendations I've talked about, we're actually going to get into a little bit more when we get into the operations review and assessment. But these would be recommendations to look at potentially adjusting rates and time limits in Zone 1 to achieve target availability of less than 85% on the block faces through there. If you do this, then potentially we're going to have to also review and adjust rates and time limits in zones 2 through 3, because what you will see is that the folks in the zone 1 area will start migrating over there. Those areas are also highly utilized, and so we may need to look at adjustments there as well, again, to get that 85% or lower utilization target. Definitely, there seems to be a lot of evidence suggesting that parking enforcement needs to be stepped up in order to cut down on violations. We also need to look at strategies to maximize the utilization of all of those public or private off-street parking facilities that are underutilized, as well as some of the underutilized public off-street facilities. Which takes us to the operational assessment. When we talk about scope of review, this is just a general checklist of all the things that we looked at. It was a comprehensive review of how the city manages parking right now, from soup to nuts, if you will. Everything from fees and fines to ordinances, policies, procedures, staffing, and I'm going to try and take you through the high spots here. Part of this process included benchmarking how other communities do parking. You can see the different communities that we benchmarked against there. I'd like to point out, included within that body is Concord, Lowell, Portsmouth, and Manchester, which are all sort of naturals, if you will, as well as a number of communities that you might not think of right off the top of your head, but have a lot of comparable dynamics to Nashua, like Missoula, Montana. And then there were a few like Albany, New York, and Ann Arbor, which have very strong programs that we would consider to be aspirational. The first thing we did was take a look at zoning requirements and the ordinances here. We looked at that from two different perspectives. From the perspective of the minimum parking requirements, for the most part, Nashua aligns very nicely with both market standards as well as their comparable set here. With a very few exceptions, there are generally at the lower end or middle end of the scale as far as it goes, and fairly appropriate for what we see as far as comparable standards recommended by Urban Land Institute and the Institute of Transportation Engineers. In addition to looking at just those parking requirements, we also looked at some of the different features that are offered within the zoning that speak to parking requirements. In a lot of cases, you have same type of features in place that we see in a lot of the other communities. There are some features that are referenced but not specifically called out, other features that are absent in your code right now that we would strongly recommend you consider working in there. These are features primarily focused on incenting greater use of existing parking assets like intra-facility shared parking. These are formal agreements where two parties agree to share the available capacity in a facility depending on their individual needs according to time of day and time of year. That's one of the ways that we talked about trying to unlock some of that underutilized private parking supply. That might be one of the ways to do that. We will go get into this a little bit more in a few minutes here, but we would suggest looking at the possibility of introducing something called an in lieu waiver payment here, so that if you had development that was coming in that was required to meet a parking minimum, but didn't want to build all of it on their site. They might have the ability to buy out of some of that by contributing into a fund specifically held by the city to build parking infrastructure as well as transportation infrastructure going forward here. One of the things that's been outlined to us is the city's interest in getting to a more sustainable future. Part of that would be incentivizing new development to include things like bicycle facilities, reductions for participation in transit, and other promotions that would really promote alternative transportation modes here. The whole idea with adding these features in is you're really being proactive in terms of setting the city up to meet its sustainability goals along the way. It's something that you could do now with the idea of a longer term strategy as you move forward. Ideally, the more that you get the private developers and private enterprise to put in minor pieces of infrastructure like bike storage, shower facilities, the more that frees up the municipality to invest in those big ticket items for sustainability like bike lanes, transit improvements, transit stations, et cetera, going forward. So it's really a hand-in-glove program. This is very top of the waves. In a few slides, I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about how we would propose implementing these, but I wanted to at least call this out as part of the review. Or we can just dive into it right now. Typically, within model zoning ordinances, you have one of two factors, either carrots or sticks. Carrots are different initiatives that are put in place to try and get folks to include elements in their project that are more sustainable or that help defray the cost in terms of transit and transportation and parking impact on the project. This would include things like the most common one that I hear, especially in communities where there are no parking requirements, are a developer is going to come in and they're going to make sure that they provide adequate parking, or they're going to come in and they make sure that they provide adequate transportation programs to support the project because it will appeal to the tenant or it'll get them superior lending terms. There are some communities that try and promote this type of investment by offering tax abatements. In the last few years, you've heard a lot of developers come in and talk about the importance of including elements like this because it gets you LEED credits, which is a certification process to show that you have a very green development project coming in. More often than not, typically the way that you compel folks to look at participating more and providing for parking or transportation infrastructure are things like parking minimums, limitations of allowable uses, or in very rare occasions, there is a direct assessment of fee associated with the development that then goes to cover the city's cost to provide for the parking or transportation if it's not built into the project. Right now, the city of Nashua has, for the most part, done away with parking minimums in the D1 and D2 districts, which is where this parking study is coming from. It's a very common policy. You see that in a lot of communities. It starts, and it has its heart in the right place. Most of the time when you see communities go over to this, they have a lot of available parking supply and very limited development that's coming in. Removing parking as an obstacle in order to incentivize development is a great way to get things jump-started. The problem is, in the long term, this policy becomes very difficult to sustain fiscally, as well as from a land use standpoint, because sooner or later all of that parking supply runs out, and The city is ultimately on the hook to continue to provide that infrastructure if you're gonna see that development continue to move forward, and that becomes very expensive. So one of the things that we've done is looked into the future and seen the day 3 to 4 to 5 years out, where potentially if something doesn't change, you may run out of parking in the downtown district here. And your strategy could be, at that point, to introduce a series of both carrots and sticks. The stick in this case would be reinstituting market-appropriate parking minimums. And like I said, a lot of the minimum requirements you've got on your books right now are market-appropriate, so you wouldn't have to go looking for that. But if you were going to reinstitute that, you could also institute a series of carrots so that developers wouldn't be stuck just dealing with this obstacle to come into downtown, where they would have to build X number of spaces to support their development. They could waiver some of those requirements by coming forward with some sort of shared use agreement, either demonstrating that they can provide enough parking within their project itself because of the nature of the project at something less than whatever the parking minimum requirements are, or that they can provide enough parking in their project because they've reached out to an abutting neighbor who has available spaces at a time when their project really needs them, and is willing to enter into an agreement to share in some of that available supply. We talked about some of the other carrots here on the mitigation side. This would include things like including a car share service within your project, and that might be worth X number of spaces off the parking minimum. Shuttle services to a satellite parking facility or common destinations, transit incentives, biking incentives, support programs, all of these things that make living car light more feasible in the future here. And then I made reference as well to the option of offering an in lieu program where they could actually purchase out of some of those waivers and contribute to a fund that the city could then draw from to provide parking infrastructure in the future. And this is a general overview. I referenced before some of the different programs that you need for car light or car-free living here. And this is a key component as you start talking about sustainability. The more that you can have developers or businesses offer these to their employees, to their patrons, the more you're going to move toward that goal of sustainability down the line here. Some key considerations if you are going to go down the road of reinstating here. The places that have been very effective when it comes to eliminating parking minimums and then not doing anything else permanently are only those facilities or only those communities that have both mass transit and a private parking market. I can't tell you the number of seminars and meetings and hearings that I've sat in where a forward-thinking planner stands up and says, we need to get rid of our parking minimums. Buffalo, New York did it, Boston did it, New York did it, and they're doing just fine. All of those places had the infrastructure in place that would allow them to do it and not put the city on the hook for taking care of that gap when it was no longer required of the private developer. Nashua is not there yet. So this is why we're saying that you may need to look at a change in policy because your changing conditions may require that in the near future here. Like I said before, it's not unusual to suspend minimums to kickstart growth, but at some point, it's also not unusual to have to reinstate those once that growth has been kickstarted and the available supply has been absorbed here. One of the questions that often comes up is, what do you do about changes of use? I will tell you as a general rule of thumb, when you talk about something like this, for whatever reason, it seems to be 10,000 square feet seems to be the guiding rule. So where You have communities that have either instituted or reinstituted parking minimums. As a general rule, they're willing to grandfather the parking requirements that were in place, or the lack of parking requirements that are in place for any type of change of use that's less than 10,000 square feet. Once it gets over 10,000 square feet, that often becomes the trigger where they become subject to whatever the new zoning code is. One of the things to consider about reinstatement is not only does reinstatement potentially move some of the parking burden, if you will, for future development back onto the private developer, or create mechanisms to get that private developer to either invest in sustainability or contribute to a fund that helps the city fill that gap. It also creates a lot more opportunities for P3 solutions, and we've seen that in a lot of comparable communities here. P3 solutions are where the private developers coming in, they're saying, well, I'm already building some parking. City, are you interested in also contributing or participating with us in this project to provide parking as well? Right now, you may not have as many of those opportunities if you did have a reinstatement of minimums, which would create, again, that sort of carrot and stick promotion here to consider that. And just real quickly, there are a whole host of different models for P3 solutions that go everywhere from the city taking a lead to the city buying a portion of the project or subsidizing a portion of the project to the city, and the private developer actually entering into a special purpose entity to advance a particular project. Most notably, you've seen these done in Portsmouth and Concord, Haverhill and Biddeford. These are all projects that have come through in the last 2, 3, 4 years that are examples of this type of P3 engagement to build parking infrastructure. One of the things we did in addition to looking at zoning is we looked at a number of your other ordinances that are on the books. You can see these sort of listed above. Some of them, Chapter 320 is very specific to parking. Others have ancillary impacts to parking, like 306, which has to do with towing, which impacts parking in that one of the things that you have to do from time to time is tow scofflaws. Chapter 74 is interesting because Chapter 74, the way it is written, is clearly the administration and enforcement of code, specifically building and zoning code, but has been interpreted as potentially applying to parking enforcement as well. And so in that case, that's one of those places where you just need a tweak of language to make it abundantly clear what the limits of the parameters are on that. In total, you'll find within the document we prepared, there are actually 71 recommended revisions of language and code. Some of these are places where you just need clarification. Some of these are places where the code that's on the books here is actually in conflict with New Hampshire RSAs. And there needs to be an alignment between those two or some sort of reference between those two. I could do 3 hours just on this. I won't, but I do want to hit just top of the waves, some of the takeaways and some of the recommendations we had on this. Towing, there were a number of recommendations here. Big takeaways on this one include the recommendation to include language which would allow for the immediate towing of vehicles parked to endanger. These are vehicles that are parked on sidewalks in front of fire hydrants, etc. It seems like a no-brainer, but that's not actually on your books right now. You don't legally have the right to tow vehicles that are parked to endanger right now. One of the things that would very much behoove you is to start publishing the current contracted rate for impounded storage. Impounded storage in the city of Nashua is actually handled through a contract with a private party. If I am Joe Schmo and I'm trying to figure out how much it could potentially cost me to violate any of the ordinances that you've got on your books right now, I have no way of figuring that out. There's no place in your ordinances, no place on your website where it's published how much that's gonna cost me. That could work for or against me here, but for the most part, my experience has been when you publish those things, it has a distinct deterrent factor because it actually puts an opportunity cost on people who are silly enough to think about this as a viable option. It also will save you from a lot of charges later on from folks who do get towed that you weren't explicit and clear of the costs associated with those penalties here. NHRSA actually has a whole section that talks about the right of disposal for impounded and unclaimed vehicles. That's not included anywhere in your code. That would be easy to import as well. Right now, the way the system works, when a vehicle is towed at the request of the city, the cost of that tow and the cost of that impound is paid by the individual to the city, who then in turn reimburses that private entity for the cost of the tow and the cost of the impound. Best practice is typically to have the individual pay the private party when they go to pick up the car for that, so the city at no time is on the hook for those costs. The city is then only obligated to collect for any outstanding fees, fines, etc., or any surcharge associated with having a call for a tow. And we would recommend clarifying the ordinances to make that abundantly clear and create that division, so that among other things, the city is not under obligation if the vehicle has to be moved multiple times for some reason, which has come up in the past in some occasions here. We would also recommend adding a surcharge to cover the cost of processing those tow fees here. Concord already does that, Manchester already does that. There's no reason you shouldn't be doing it too. I talked a little bit earlier, your code right now says 48 hours is the maximum length of stay. State RSA says 24 is the maximum length of stay on a public right of way. Just amend the code to bring it into line with state RSA, or include within your code a reason why you're deviating from the state RSA. One of the things that's very interested in the code is if you are subject to tow because of a number of unpaid parking tickets, there are two different standards on your books right now. One standard that exists, I believe, between April 1st and October 1st, and another standard that exists during the winter months here. And it's kind of confusing, and we didn't necessarily see particular value to it to the constituent here, so our recommendation would be converting to just a single standard throughout the course of the year. If you have 3 outstanding unpaid parking tickets over $100, regardless of the time of year, you are now eligible for tow and impound if you don't resolve that. We would also ask the city to consider, at least for unpaid parking violations, to consider embracing the process of immobilization rather than towing. Just as a second avenue here. You can still collect your fees, etc., but you don't necessarily need to involve a third party if you have to move a vehicle. We understand there are going to be circumstances where you still need to tow and impound the vehicle, but it just gives you another way to enforce that policy without having to involve a third party. I keep hitting my laptop because I think that's going to help. I'm going to change my thing. Chapter 320, again, there are dozens of recommendations here. The real big ones that I pulled out of this, as I go through chapter 320, underneath the section that talks about metered parking, there are subsections that talk about the Downtown Improvement Committee and parking permit areas. These are major policies on the books of every municipality we looked at, and usually they have their own independent articles. It would be our recommendation to pull those sections out of the article talking about meters and create them as in their own independent articles just for clarity and ease of searching and understanding in the code. The way that the Downtown Improvement Committee gets funded is through a very complicated series of calculations with regards to how much money was collected in meter revenues for the year, and then what percentage over a certain threshold then goes
We just changed that.
to the committee. And our recommendation was just to simplify that in such a way that you're sure that that committee is getting a reliable funding source.
To bring you up.
We got one done.
To bring you up to speed, I'll let Alderman Clemmons clearly define, because that's his committee. Do you want to explain to him
Well-
what has recently happened?
Basically, check. You can put a check mark next to that one.
Okay. The other thing is, and this would go under the article where you pull parking permits out here. Our recommendation in terms of best practice is to get rid of any policy that creates any type of reserved parking for permit parking, and anything that creates a geographic restriction on who can receive or get parking permits. And this basically comes down to best practice, which is you want to allow for permitted parking, you want to be able to sell permits, but when you sell reserve parking permits, you really take a lot of the flexibility out of the system to serve multiple users. In addition, you are, by practice, if not by actual legality, deeding public property over to the exclusive use of a private party. So our recommendation is to do away with that. We also understand that there were reasons at one time for restricting who could buy parking permits in certain facilities to a particular geographic area. However, we think that you can there are other ways to make sure that people are getting parking permits without having to create these sort of artificial restrictions that then take a piece of public infrastructure off the table for a vast majority of the general public. One of the things that we came to the conclusion of as we were reading through is there needs to be language in the ordinance very clearly defining the roles and responsibilities of the parking director. Parking director is referenced obliquely in a number of different areas, but as far as defining their role, their responsibilities, their duties, it's nowhere within the ordinances right now. I will also go forward in saying that the other recommendation is to define that individual's relationship with regards to policymaking, rules and regulations with the Board of Aldermen and their particular subcommittees. Under best practices, typically, the person who heads up the parking department is usually originating policy, they're originating regulations, and they're bringing them to a public representative board like this one for debate and approval or rejection. But it is a fairly rare occasion where you're actually seeing rulemaking and policy making being done at this level and then dictated down the other way. Ideally, whoever's running the parking system is the one that you want originating those policies, procedures, et cetera, and then bringing them to you for review, consideration, communication to constituents, and debate before either approval, modification, or denial, one of the two. On a much lesser note here, rather than designating and marking parallel parking spaces, we would recommend looking at the consolidation of parallel parking areas into alleys, only because it makes for more efficient use. When you do parallel spaces, you can only get one vehicle per space. When you do alleys, folks, depending on how talented they are as drivers, may be able to get 2, 3, 4 more cars into the same section of roadway than you can when you are designating parallel parking spaces. It's just a way to get more use out of your curbside parking. The way you're dealing with designation of on-street handicap parking spaces is fine right now. It's aligned with all of the best practices we've seen. The only thing that we would change is, once you've designated those, they should be subject to a periodic needs test and use test just to make sure that they're still valid. There are some curbside handicapped parking spaces that were established under petition initially, and that petitioner has since moved, expired, or something else. That space could very easily revert back. There's no mechanism right now to test whether that space should revert back. Finally, there are, I think, 8 or 9 different designated 1-hour parking areas on your books. I think there's 6 or 7 different designated 2-hour parking areas on your books. The difference between these areas typically is the hours of enforcement. Some of them start at 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night and extend till 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night. But all of them are 2-hour, 1-hour areas. They're still sort of covering the same core time period. Just to simplify things, our recommendation would be to try and cook those down to just 1, 2, or 3 1-hour parking areas, 1, 2, or 3 2-hour parking areas. We would also recommend you consider converting the parking spaces that are marked as 15 or 30-minute parking areas to 1-hour parking, only because it is almost impossible without the aid of technology to effectively enforce a 15 or 30-minute parking area. You just can't get people out there patrolling often enough. And I understand that it's very often done for political reasons, and I certainly would acknowledge that and bow to that consideration, but from a purely parking operations perspective, it's almost, like I said, it's almost impossible to enforce 15 and 30-minute parking. You can still have it on your books, just understand you can't get enough people out there to do that type of patrol and make sure there's compliance with that. In terms of looking at the parking department and looking at how they're sort of structured, we looked at this parking department, we looked at all the other parking departments, we looked at best practices, and what we sort of took away from this was any municipality you've got, whoever the agency is that's handling parking, they should have a clearly defined mission. They should live under the agency that's most responsible for that defined mission. Wherever you can, you should consolidate all the functions associated with the parking system under that single agency. It's more efficient, it's easier for the outside user when they've got an issue or question to come to one place. The best systems out there are self-sustaining, but they're also fairly transparent about that self-sustaining nature here and how they get there. And all of the systems we looked at that were truly premier had some sort of oversight mechanism to preserve the public interest. So with that in mind, our recommendations for this parking department were based on our discussion with constituents, with members of the department, members of economic development. This department really exists to continue to support the continued growth and vitality and commerce of downtown. And that should be their defining mission. As long as that continues to be their defining mission, as opposed to operating on a net revenue neutral position or making money, they should live under economic development. If they were to suddenly shift focus and become a revenue producer for the city, then you would probably want to move them under finance because their mission had changed and the oversight should change as well. But the way they're structured right now, their mission right now is such that economic development seems like the right place for them to live. There are a number of functions that are handled outside of parking that could be brought in-house, including permit administration, citation processing, and ticket adjudication. It would make sense to just bring those into the parking department for clarity, for greater efficiency, and for better cross-communication between different functions and disciplines. We would recommend the parking department look at moving over to an enterprise fund. The idea with an enterprise fund is you're consolidating revenues, expenses, and debt obligations under a single accounting or financial structure here. It makes it easier to be transparent. It makes it easier to show where the monies are coming in and where the monies are going out. It makes it easier if you've got to do an annual report or statement back to the constituency each year. And it just follows best practices here. And then we would also recommend the creation of a formal body consisting of stakeholders, citizens, and city staff that would be meeting with parking department leadership on a regularly scheduled basis to discuss issues, to provide that public oversight into what is basically a public asset. In taking a look at structure and at staffing, one of the things that really struck us was the way parking department here in Nashua is structured versus sort of the classic structure that we've seen. And the classic structure that we've seen is usually a 4-tier structure. And that tier is usually headed by a nominal leader who is got financial oversight over all operations, but they're the one who's really in charge of budgeting, they're in charge of policy making, they're in charge of political outreach, they're the face of the organization, they're the ones who are liaisoning with other community members and other organizations, and they're really focused on the strategy of the organization. The day-to-day operations is usually done by an operations team who's got oversight, and they're basically there to make sure that the trains run on time, for lack of a better term, that critical supervisory level that makes sure that the core mission of the system is being executed on a daily basis, and they're overseeing the service team, who are actually the line employees, and the support team who handle a lot of the back of house operations. In Nashua right now, your parking director really is both your executive and your operations team, feeding down to a limited service team and a limited support team, of which some of that support team is actually included in other offices, not integrated within that office at this time. So there's some room for change there. We tried to look at what the staffing requirements were and what appropriate staffing would be. When you talk about parking operations, parking maintenance, it's sort of the question that got posed to Abraham Lincoln at one point, which is how long a man's legs should be. Well, they should be long enough to reach the ground. How many people should you have involved in parking? Enough to actually execute the missions and the duties and responsibilities they have in place. As a more objective measure here, we took a look at the systems for all those different comparable communities we looked at, the size of those, the total number of staff, and did some fairly simple division to figure out how many staff were responsible for X number of spaces on the side of operations and maintenance. And just from that takeaway, what we realized was Nashua was doing a lot more with a lot less than all of their other peers. Manchester was probably the closest, but everybody else was staffed on a much lower ratio than what Nashua was. On the question of enforcement, it was actually a little, we didn't have to go the Abraham Lincoln route. It was a little bit easier. We could just take a look at the amount of ground that these folks had to cover every day based on the regulations that were in place, and how long it would take to cover those circuits to adequately enforce the stuff that you have in the books. And what we did was we came up with this calculation and said, all right, this is the length of the circuit. This is how long people are going to be traveling that circuit on average, the number of circuits they've got to do per day. how long it's gonna take them each day, the number of days a week, that translates to hours a week, and at the end of the day, just to perform basic patrol, you're gonna need at least 112 hours of labor in order to do that, or if you round that up, 3 full-time equivalent parking enforcement officers just to do that. Right now, the parking department is actually authorized for 4, and right now they have a little bit less than 1 full-time equivalent. So remember when we were talking about Main Street and the number of violators up and down the street here, and the question of whether enforcement was being done? Enforcement's not being done, and it's not being done because there aren't enough people to do it right now. So in looking at all of this, what we came back with was a series of recommendations for look at staffing and training specific to the parking department. The biggest one being, in the immediate future, we need to add in that second layer on the operations side here, so that we can free up Jill, or whoever's sitting in the parking director's seat, to do a lot more of that higher level strategy, policy, financial management, budgeting that they're supposed to be doing, and let somebody else really focus on getting the day-to-day stuff done. That would mean adding at least 1, preferably 2 operations managers. If you're going to do 2, 1 would be on the operations and maintenance side, and 1 would be on the enforcement side. In addition, based on the staffing ratios, just the staffing ratios we saw, and the execution of duties required, you really need at least 1 more full-time equivalent staff member on the operations and maintenance side just to do the direct service. Based on a lot of the back of house you need and the consolidation of some of the duties that are held in other departments under parking, you would need 1 full-time equivalent clerk on the operations and maintenance side, and then another one over on the enforcement side in order to handle all of that activity here. And as I mentioned, really need at least 3 full-time equivalent PEOs. Because we've got less than 1 right now, the recommendation would be to try and find a way to hire 3 full-time equivalents as soon as possible. For the most part, parking is doing a good job with training relative to their peer institutions. There are some things that could be done better. These include participation in programs put on by the National Parking Association and IPMI, which would help build their knowledge base, and also start to really develop a consolidated standard operating procedure manual, which they already have the bones of, and like most departments in this country, only need to assemble into a comprehensive document. The value of this document being that it would help with the transfer of knowledge during turnover from one group to the other as they come in and out. On the maintenance side, we did not come across anything that suggested that the parking department wasn't following best practices and doing a good job. We would recommend, just based on what we know about the life cycle of facilities here. I know at one point there was an assessment done to do restoration on the Elm Street garage and High Street garage. As I mentioned before, these represent a significant portion of the off-street parking supply held in public hands here. And we would definitely encourage the full expenditure necessary to extend the life cycle on those, unless, and I'm going to put an asterisk on this, when we get into future conditions here at a later date, one of the things that we'll talk about is the potential to develop a larger, more efficient, and newer facility at the current location of the High Street garage and the Factory Street lot. And if at some point the city made the decision that they wanted to go down that road rather than this expenditure. Obviously, we wouldn't recommend for the expenditure and restoration on a facility that might be torn down in the next 20 years. But if you're planning to keep that facility for the next 20 years, it would make sense to make that full expenditure. And at one point, I had prepared an analysis based on the amount of money needed to extend the life cycle of these two facilities. I think it was about an $8 million investment. And if you translated that into today's costs to build structured parking, $8 million would buy you about 300 parking spaces. Or $8 million will extend the life cycle of the 800 parking spaces you've got in place right now. So when it comes to a cost benefit, we recommend spending the $8 million to extend the life cycle of the 800 spaces you have. There's a lot of good documentation. Again, under maintenance, we would just recommend getting it into a comprehensive SOP. And also, we would recommend the city consider the establishment of a sinking fund in the future to pay for periodic repair and replacement of major elements. This restoration study that you just had done on the Elm Street and High Street garage highlighted how important it is to do this periodic repair and replacement here. All establishing this fund does is create a fund for you to draw against that rather than having to come up with those monies after a major appraisal. On the enforcement side, again, we already talked about the calculations for necessary manpower to do enforcement. You could reduce the number of man hours that you needed if you were to look at installing parking access and revenue control systems equipment in some of the facilities. I'm going to talk about that in a minute and the cost benefit of that. Another thing that would make enforcement easier is you have a number of on-street meters in downtown that are all older, single-head electronic coin-op meters. They're reaching the end of their service life anyhow. This is as good a time as any to look at replacing them with smart meters, which accept multiple forms of payment. You can still pay with them in coins, credit cards, debit cards, Apple Pay, Google Pay, what have you. And they offer a much more robust back end that will give you a lot of great data for real-time policy making later on. Where you're going to pull those off, where you're going to pull those out in some of the off-street facilities like the Spring Street garage, if you were going to go down that road, you might be better served to do kiosks rather than single-head meters in those cases because there would be cost savings. The current parking management enforcement system you've got in place, which is a T2 system, is also reaching the end of its service life, and it would make sense to start looking for either an upgrade of that system or replacement of that system going forward here. That would make both management and enforcement a lot easier. And there are increasingly more and more opportunities out there as you see more and more companies come into the market to sign up for pilots for new technology applications. Nashua just happens to have the right blend of demographics where they would be a great location to pilot some of these. Very often when folks are coming forth, I'll give you a prime example. I was approached a few years ago by a couple grad school students at MIT that had come up with a system for monitoring length of stay and availability on surface streets through cameras that were mounted on light poles. They really wanted to find a municipality where they could do a pilot on this and see how effective it was. They graduated from MIT before they could get Cambridge to agree to their proposal. So, like I said, there are a lot of these opportunities that are out there. If they are available, we encourage the city to pursue those because it gives you the ability to test drive some of these technologies here. On the parking access and revenue control side, if you were to put gated, automated parking access control equipment in the Elm Street and High Street garage. Total cost for that type of conversion would be around $375,000. If you looked at what it costs to patrol those, what you would be paying a parking enforcement officer to do that, over a 10-year period, it is about the same equivalent cost in terms of wages and labor as what you would spend on this equipment, which has about a 10-year service life. So you could reduce the number of parking enforcement officers you have out there by one full-time equivalent position by installing automated access control equipment in those two facilities, and it would be a revenue neutral proposition. In addition, the installation of this equipment would give you more flexibility in terms of managing the facility, better information on how the facility is actually utilized. You could potentially improve the security of the facility by also automating the exterior doors so that folks could only get in and out of those doors with credentials here, parking ticket or parking pass or something like that, which would allow you to secure the facility better, and would offer you, again, a very robust data stream coming out to do future calculations. We also looked at the layout on all the other facilities that the public, that the city owns right now. The only other two that you could even think about putting equipment on are Spring Street and Pine Street. They're the only two that have a design where you could, at fairly reasonable cost, equip them. There's not as compelling a case for doing that from a cost-benefit standpoint. They only represent, in terms of patrolling, the equivalent of about 1/3 of a full-time equivalent parking enforcement officer, and you would actually be paying more to put the equipment in than you would to continue to operate those as a park pay and display or permitted facility. But it's want to provide the information for you as a consideration. One of the things that we heard a lot was about snow emergencies and snow emergency management. We actually looked at the job that Nashua did relative to all of the other communities that we surveyed on multiple different perspectives. And I'll be real honest, Nashua stacks up very well against all of its peers and all of the other comparable communities we looked at. The only thing that we could find that Nashua doesn't do that some other communities do is there are a select number, a handful of communities in our survey group that have a single designated facility that they send people to for snow storage. It is the snow emergency facility that folks go and park in during a snow emergency so that they can clear all of the other lots, streets, et cetera, that need to be cleared. Nashua doesn't have that luxury right now to have one central facility as far as that goes. But in terms of everything else, the way they notify the general public, the way they communicate to them, the different benefits that are offered during a snow emergency to accommodate folks, they do as good a job as anybody else out there, and we couldn't find fault with their program despite the complaints that we heard regarding it. Inversely, when it came to communications, we believe that the parking department could do a lot of different things, a lot of things different to improve outreach and communications to the general public. Nashua as a city does a great job of reaching out to their constituents and communicating to their constituents through central resources. So I don't want to give the impression that Nashua is not communicating or that the parking department is not communicating through those avenues. What makes the parking department in Nashua different than some of the other parking departments we looked at was basically they didn't necessarily have a branded or a communication channel specific to them. It all came through the city as far as that goes. Whereas a lot of these other municipalities, the agency that was handling parking had a dedicated helpline, a dedicated Facebook page, a dedicated Twitter feed. All of these things are fairly easy to correct as far as that goes, and all they would do is help clarify and focus communication from the parking department to its customers and constituents. One of the big recommendations that we have is that the parking department formalize their mission in a mission statement. There is no formalized mission statement for the parking department right now. We feel that that's important because it helps focus everything else that they do. And we would also recommend that they consider starting to produce an annual report specifically to the constituents, talking about fiscal performance, improvements, lessons learned, pilots. Because this is a public asset, the ability to annually communicate out to the general public the benefits that have been derived from this asset, the cost of maintaining and running this asset, helps really continue to have very clear communication to the general public here. Not every facility, or not every agency we looked at has a walk-in center, but the ones that usually had the highest levels of customer satisfaction had some sort of central place where an individual could go physically and talk to a customer service associate. Nashua has that right now. Unfortunately, that is also their central operations office. So it would be great to establish some sort of walk-in center for the parking department that could be staffed by a clerk who's also doing other things, but is potentially removed from at least by 10 or 15 feet from the administrative offices here. So that's pretty much communications. And then we started to take a look at the parking permit programs. And when we take a look specifically at the permit programs run by Nashua versus their peers, especially the fees that are collected, one of the things that we noticed was Nashua is very much the lower end of the scale as far as that goes. Most of the other communities we looked at charge more for permits. They charged a broad range of rates for permits based on different levels of access, different facilities, whereas Nashua has very low costs, sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. A covered garage is a covered garage is a covered garage versus an uncovered garage versus a surface lot. Our recommendation is to look at revising both rates and general permit program structure. The recommendation would be to create basically 3 different types of permits in the city of Nashua. One would be a universal permit. This would allow the holder to park in any city of Nashua public off-street facility at any time, with the exception of snow emergencies and other bans. You would offer a limited number of these, and hopefully the cost of these would be to some degree its own deterrent here, but you're offering a tremendous benefit. So by the same token, you should be collecting a reasonable fee for the flexibility that that offers. And then within a 3-tier system, you would be looking at either full access permit, which would give you the rights to park 24/7 in a particular facility. Day access, which would give you a discounted rate if you were only looking for parking during standard business hours. And then an off-peak option for folks who are looking to park nights and weekends. And this would probably be most appealing to residents who are looking for off-street parking in the area. The tiers really are reflective of the relative utilization of the different facilities that are in the system right now. And the idea would be to price these according to that utilization or demand for those facilities. So Le Parc Renaissance, Water Street, Pearson lot, Spring Street lot, the new lot that's replacing the old School Street lot, which is called, we come up with a name for that?
School Street.
Which is,
School
so
Street lot.
the new old School Street lot, all of those, very highly utilized, great demand for, permit parking in those, so those would command the highest tier rate. The next highest tier rate would be associated with the library annex, High Street, Factory Street, Elm Street, High Street Garage, and then lowest utilization, was afforded to Pine Street, Maple Street, Library Staff Lot. Those would be the lowest priced parking permits. I talked a little bit earlier about going away from a system that controls demand and access by either geographic prescription or this is the counter to that, and it is a system that sets up rates that folks then choose according to their own means and needs, what rate they are most interested or what type of access they need. But it's a market-based system rather than a prescriptive system. So it allows for individual choice, and yet the rates are set at a level where you're not going to get oversubscription for the most part.
Andy, these, just to clarify, these are monthly rates.
These are monthly rates, yes.
Alderman Clemmons.
Can I ask just a clarifying question, because I know what we're going into. These recommendations, do all of these fee changes support the staffing changes that you recommended earlier?
We have not done that level of due diligence yet. We believe so, but we have not done that level of due diligence yet to run the numbers through to confirm that in point of fact, they will cover all of those costs.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, and I really want to get through this presentation before we get into the discussion this evening, but I do think it is a very good point that is being made, and I think it should be a guiding principle that that we move forward with any type of changes with an acknowledgement or an understanding that we need to be revenue positive. That way we are not burdening the taxpayer and that the residential taxpayer in particular, and that truly we try to cover the costs based off of their revenue that's generating. And so therefore, really it goes hand in glove with how much you're willing to change some of these permits, fees, fines, that will then actually tell us what type of budget we have to work with, and then we can come back and make recommendations to you based off of the availability of funds, what our highest priorities may be.
Thank you.
The next area that we looked at was fines, both the fine structure and the amount being charged for fines. Again, Nashua was sort of at the lower end of the scale in a lot of areas based on what we looked at here in terms of comparable communities. The other thing that made looking at this fine structure challenging were some of the ordinances you have in the books. One of the ordinances you have on the books is a repeat offender ordinance, which basically says it is one fine if an individual has a first offense, it's another fine if an individual has a second offense. The fine then escalates for the third offense and then the fourth offense. The problem with the ordinance is it doesn't clarify how it doesn't clarify how those offenses are being counted. So it's not clear if you have to get a ticket, if the ticket you get for overtime parking is a first offense, if you have to get another overtime parking to qualify as a second offense, another overtime parking to qualify as a third offense, or if the first offense can be overtime parking, the second offense is not paying for the meter, and the third offense is parking on the sidewalk here. That piece is not very clear. So one of the things that occurred to us was if we couldn't necessarily change that ordinance wholesale, we could change the fine structure to make that a little bit clearer so you would understand how to assess that. The other thing that was very clear to us is in a lot of these other communities that we looked at, fines were set and grouped together according to the type of the offense. So there were certain offenses that were considered minor offenses, and those were all $10. And then there were other offenses that were life safety offenses, and those might all be $50, and other offenses that were major offenses that were $75 or $100, something along those lines. You didn't necessarily have the same type of unifying theme here. So what we set out to do was to create sort of a unifying theme to address that, and then also make some adjustments to bring those fines up closer to what we're seeing as far as the median for the survey that we looked at. So our suggestion is to reorganize the fines into one of 7 categories. So some of the fines, the lowest fines, would be revenue offenses. This is not paying for the meter, failure to pay, expired meter, expired pay, minor offenses like misparking, where you're parking across 2 parking spaces. These would all be potentially revenue violations. Nuisance violations would be things like overnight parking, parking in a permit space without a permit, something along those lines, that create a nuisance but not necessarily a public safety danger and are not related with revenue. They're more damaging to the public than just the revenue violations are, so they carry a slightly higher fine. And then there are some fines that are major public impact fines, like parking in no parking zone, parking in a loading zone, parking against traffic. These all should be subject to a slightly higher offense. Life safety violations, things like parking in a fire zone, should be subject to an even stiffer fine as far as that goes. And then major life safety, like blocking a fire hydrant, again, you need to escalate that. Snow emergencies, because they incorporate all of these things. They're public impact, they're a life safety, they're a major life safety issue. We want to set those rates, that penalty very high. And then on the handicap side here, the state actually prescribes the handicap violation. So we actually adopted 250 instead of 200 because it's in the state and the state RSA here. The idea with putting these into one of 7 categories makes it easier on the multiple offender side, because now you don't need to necessarily say it's the same offense over and over again. It's the same offense within a particular category. So, first revenue offense, second revenue offense, third revenue offense. And within that category, there may be a number of different offenses, but they're all organized around the same theme, if you will. The other thing that we really wanted to institute that wasn't in place necessarily right now was a very clear escalation schedule. Ideally, what you want to do is set your fines in such a way that if they're paid within a certain period of time, the fine is whatever the posted fine is. Once you go over a certain period of time, when there's a delay and there's not an appeal to it, you want to increase the pressure for that fine to get paid. A fine that never gets paid is a fine that never changes behavior, and ultimately, that's what you're trying to do with fines. So we had come up with a fairly simple structure that went 15 days, 30 days, 90 days, and then 90 plus days as far as escalation goes. The last area that I wanted to touch on was transit or meter rates here. Again, looking at what's being collected in Nashua versus what's being collected in other communities. We're at the lower end of the scale. Shouldn't be a surprise. I think the last time permit rates, Justin, was 2011.
That was before, 2011 was the meter rate.
This was the meter rates, so the permit rates were adjusted in 2002. Okay. So it's kind of no surprise that we're sort of at the lower end of the scale because it's been a long time since adjustments here. And as we all know, inflation has started to creep up. The tier structure that you've got in place right now, or the zone structure you've got in place is really good. Our recommendation would just be to look at increasing it slightly, one, to reflect the amount of inflation that's incurred since the last adjustment, two, to create a little bit more incentive for turnover, because if you remember, all of those areas are very highly utilized. And then we had also made some recommendations for potential changing the hours of enforcement. Zone 1 right now, which has a length of stay of maximum length of stay of 90 minutes at $1 an hour, and is enforced Monday through Friday from 9 to 7. We would propose increasing that to $1.50 an hour, but also increasing the allowable length of stay to 2 hours. But then also looking at increasing the hours of enforcement to 9 p.m. And specifically looking at that increasing hours of enforcement in 9 to 9 p.m. because of the opening of the Performing Arts Center and the anticipation that that's going to drive demand much later into the evening than what you've seen traditionally prior to this. With Zone 2, we're looking at going up, basically maintaining the same hours of enforcement, going up a quarter an hour, but extending length of stay there to 3 hours as opposed to the 2 hour limit right now. With Zone 3, we'd look again at going up a quarter, potentially capping recommended length of stay at 8 hours, although we could see continuing to go limitless at this. The only value to the 8 hour length of stay is it would correspond roughly to the hours of enforcement, and just make that create a little bit of a regulation or obstacle so that those facilities weren't getting overburdened constantly. If you were to go to a gated system, we had also developed proposed gated rates off of this transit schedule. The idea being that you would actually have a standard rate, and then you would also want to provide a discount rate for qualifying seniors, disabled individuals, and veterans, which aligns to some degree with some of the practices you've got in place here in town right now already. And then the last recommendation, and again, this is acknowledging, we want to acknowledge it's been a long time since the last rate adjustment. Changing rates in municipalities is always difficult. It's always challenging. It is always a emotionally and politically fraught process. By the same token, it's also a fiscal reality. It's an operational reality. It's a policy reality. The best rates encourage turnover, encourage balancing of supply and demand, by raising the rates in super popular facilities and lowering them or doing away with them in less popular facilities. So there's an incentive to balance supply and demand. This can only be done, however, through periodic adjustment. There are 3 really good models out there that we would recommend for consideration and adoption. Ann Arbor actually does a 5-year plan that they take a look at current operating conditions, future fiscal needs over the next 5 years, and then they come up with a proposed rate escalation program that goes out 5 years. They go through an extensive public vetting process first before it's adopted, but then once it's put in place, it is set for the next 5 years. So it's predictable, it's proactive as far as meeting the needs of the system going forward, and it also gives them a 5-year annual check-in to adjust rates if they need to reflect whatever changes in conditions might be. Missoula, Montana, which is roughly the same size and has a very similar composition to Nashua, has been struggling with this for years. They actually passed a resolution which formalizes the process they have to go through to do an annualized public review of the conditions that they have. They've set a clear set of matrix under which they can only consider changes in rates if certain matrix or performance matrix are met, such as utilization. And then they are required to go through a data collection period to substantiate those conditions. They're required to go through an internal fiscal process, which is eventually made public, to demonstrate the need for these changes and the potential benefit for these changes. And then they have to go through a public review process to vet those out before they're enacted. But it's a very transparent system. Everybody knows the rules. It's very clear as far as that goes. Since Missoula has instituted this, they've gone through 3 cycles of this. Only 1 cycle where they actually made a change. The other 2 cycles, the conclusion of the process was that the change was unnecessary given the set metrics and the finances of the department at the time. But what it does do is it gives them a mechanism or an avenue rather than waiting and then suddenly having to come in with a substantial rate change. They have an ability to check in on an annual basis and bring that by as an as-needed basis. Portland in Oregon, actually, interestingly enough, has built an entire philosophy of financing around their city government, which their parking department is part of here. As part of that department goes through a cost of service evaluation every 2 years. And they come back, and if the escalation in cost of service results in a rate change of, I think, less than 10% over the prior rate change, they're actually approved by ordinance to go through with that rate change, or they're pre-approved, if you will. If it's more than a 10% adjustment, then there is a public hearing process and approval process they have to go through before they administer that change. But it all ties back to the city's core finance philosophy that every agency should be self-supporting. So they have a solid financial underpinning behind this. I know I've talked about a lot of stuff this evening here. I've covered a lot of ground. The good news is there is a, Jill, you want to hold that up for a minute here? There's a very large electronic document that Jill will be circulating shortly. It's a bit under 300 pages. It includes a lot of, in the appendices, a lot of the programs that I've talked about that have been initiated by other cities. It includes all of the analysis that's gone in behind these recommendations, philosophy and the thinking behind those. So hopefully that will help substantiate some of this and answer some of the questions that you have. I'm sure that I will be back in front of this body in the near future. I know I will be back in front of this body in the near future to talk about future conditions and the proposed implementation program. And I'm sure I'll be back in front of this body to talk about the meat of the presentation this evening. But you made it all, 75 slides. I'm tapped out.
Mr. Hill, I thank you very much, and I gotta compliment all the members of the committee. Nobody seems blurry-eyed, so that's good. Alderman Como.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Director Cummings, I have about a page worth of questions, and rather than sit here and go back and forth with you for half an hour, would you prefer that I just email you so that you have some time to put some answers together, and that way we're not here until midnight?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yes,
I will,
please.
I'll send you a summary of my questions then later.
I appreciate that, thank you.
Yeah, if I can say, I think finally that you see what I've kind of worked with and what we sat through. This is a lot to chew on. So I would like to have in the future, before we even start down and keep, I'm gonna open up the meeting for discussion, but keep in mind, we're not gonna resolve it tonight. So that being said, I think I would like to have a conversation with the president of the board, Director Cummings, and probably the chair of PEDC and infrastructure. Maybe we might be able to divide some of these particular subjects up and stuff like that, and start to have prioritize, and then come back to the board on what their priorities would be, and then to come up with a workable program. So that being said, Alderman Jettie, you have a question?
Thank you. Are we going to be asking questions tonight, or are we going to be
Well,
sending emails? And
You can ask a question, but I think this was a presentation, and there's really not big solution, because I don't think we have a solution in our
Right.
shared pocket yet.
So I just have a clarifying question, if I could, Mr.
Sure,
Chairman.
absolutely.
So, so here's my thinking, and you could, tell me, why I'm not correct in this, or if maybe I am. But I'm thinking, like with your recommendations about parking rates, and based upon what Director Cummings said, and I think Alderman Clemmons, and I think you yourself said it. I think we have an, there are different purposes to parking regulations. One is to provide parking so people have parking and they can come downtown and have a place to park. The other is to kind of regulate where they park and turn over parking in certain areas. And also, I think, it should, in my opinion, it should be self-sufficient. We should generate enough revenue to maintain, operate the parking department, maintain the facilities, so that so that it doesn't cost, as Director Cummings pointed out, taxpayers money for this. So with that being said, I'm thinking of your recommendation. Right now, parking ends at I think 7 p.m. on Main Street, and other places it's 6 p.m. and other places it's 5 p.m. And we talked at another meeting about how the performing arts, the National Center for the Arts, is going to bring a lot of people downtown, and there's a potential there to generate a lot of revenue for parking. But in your recommendation, you talked about extending the hours to 9 p.m., and you specifically mentioned the Center for the Arts. But I'm thinking, these shows, they start at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, they go to 11 or so. So I would think that the parking should extend till 11 p.m. I think that we should dissuade people from parking on Main Street, incentivize them to park in the garages. And they should, if they're paying $50 for a ticket to go see some act, they're not gonna balk at paying $5 or $6 for parking. And Main Street, you know, is, you know, I don't wanna see people parking on Main Street and going into the theater and staying there all night. I wanna see the Main Street parking available to the restaurants. You know, they do a lot of takeout business, and, you know, you wanna free up those spaces so that, you know, people can come in, go to the restaurant, get their takeout and leave, or even if they eat there, they're not gonna be there for more than an hour and a half, 2 hours. Whereas in the theater, they're gonna be there for an extended period of time. So, you know, why wouldn't we shorten the time on Main Street and extend the hours, you know, till 11 o'clock everywhere? You know, why not do that?
Well, in terms of shortening the time on Main Street, one of the one of the comments that we heard frequently within the survey that we got, as well as through stakeholders, was a request to extend the length of stay on Main Street, that 90 minutes wasn't enough for folks who were going in to do dining, to conduct their business. Would you consider going to 2 hours? In looking at typical length of stay based on the LPI that we did going up and down Main Street, 2 hours was about the typical length of stay that you're seeing, regardless of the 90-minute limitation or not. And because we have limited resources for enforcement right now, you can continue to keep the 90 minutes on the books, but 2 hours is more feasible as far as enforcement goes. So there are a number of arguments for extending the length of stay. And when we talked about extending length of stay, we talked about 30 minutes, but we also talked about a significant proportionate increase in cost as well. So the feeling was you could extend the length of stay slightly, you could increase the cost to stay significally, and between that increased cost and the ability to effectively enforce what's a natural inclination for 2 hours to begin with, you could, between those two forces, you could be fairly sure that you could get a 2-hour compliance going up and down. So that's my convoluted way of explaining the logic for extending from 90 minutes to 2 hours. On the enforcement side, I could see a potential argument for increasing enforcement to later hours in the evening on an event-by-event basis. The recommendation to extend out to 9 o'clock at night was based primarily on the field observations and level of utilization that we saw through Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3 in later evening hours after enforcement had expired in those areas, and there was still a very high level of utilization as far as that goes. The idea of extending from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock was really a response to that data rather than the anticipated impact of the Performing Arts Center, although we know that the Performing Arts Center on those event nights is going to bring in a significant amount of demand. I can see an argument on performing arts, on event nights, the Performing Arts Center, for extending hours of enforcement into a later period here to make sure that you've got the turnover and the availability on the curbside parking. From a policy perspective, I'm not abundantly clear how you write that, because for the most part, the whole idea with policy is that it's fairly predictable and fixed. And now we're talking about potentially amending the policy for, 50 events a year, something along those lines. I'm not sure how you do that exactly. I would advise going to 11 o'clock, hours of enforcement at 11 o'clock everywhere across the downtown, because there's just not enough demand in a lot of sections in downtown to merit enforcement for that length of time, nor is there the requirement for turnover in a lot of the sections of downtown where you would need to go to a mandatory 11 o'clock. The thing that I will tell you about hours of enforcement is usually it is, there is a period of the most effective systems set a pilot to evaluate the impact of hours of enforcement, and then we'll adjust those hours of enforcement according to the data that's generated by the pilot. For example, Burlington, Vermont had instituted a tier pricing system for their downtown meters. And for the most utilized meters in downtown, they had gone initially to a 9 o'clock cutoff for hours of enforcement, with the promise that they would monitor conditions over a 6-month period, and if it turned out that utilization fell below 85% at any time before 9 o'clock, they would adjust their hours of enforcement back to wherever that benchmark is, because the whole idea was to create availability and turnover. And they actually ended up coming from 9 o'clock back to 8 o'clock at night because it met those standards. For something like this, I think to some degree you've got to feel your way along. So 9 o'clock is what I could justify based on the data that we had from the field observations that we had. Once the Performing Arts Center opens, I very well may need to do another pilot and take some additional surveys over a period of time to figure out if 9 o'clock is really the right time, if 10 o'clock should be the time on a Saturday or Friday night. And then this event thing is a whole nother animal that requires study as well.
Okay, thank you.
Alderman Clemmons.
Thank you. I just want to say, wonderful presentation. It's a great report. You know, I obviously we differed on opinions about the way to implement the overnight parking portion of it. But I do want to say that I agree with most of what's in here and most of what was presented tonight. Maybe not all of the fees. I certainly believe in a balanced budget, so that'll be an interesting conversation going forward. But so we'll have to see. I think there's a lot of work to be done with it, but I think it's a great. I really think it was a great benefit to our city to see this plan, and because again, you know, we haven't done anything with parking really since 2011. I was on the board at that time, and at that time, it was just as big of a study, and it was just as big of a well, maybe not as big as a study, but it was certainly as big politically as far as where the appetite of the community was, the things that we needed to do. So, you know, it having been over 10 years now, I think we're ready to go into the next portion of this conversation. And so I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done.
Thank you.
Alderman Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm not going to be as kind as to send my questions or comments, but I want to agree this was a great report, and thank you very much for doing it. I also agree that an enterprise fund would be really good for transparency and being able to see everything that goes on. One of the comments that you made about was repeat offenders and so on. And one of the issues that Ms. Stansfield can acknowledge that I'd had within my ward was at one point we had a tractor trailer who was taking up multiple spaces, and they would park and get the $25, pay the $75, and then it was wiped clean. And we would start all over again. We couldn't get this, and it was cheaper for them to pay the $75 than to try to find parking. You know, the $25 a night than to try to find it. It was cheaper to do that. That's one of my concerns is I saw when you talked about if they have more than this, it goes up, tier-wise, it goes up as far as it, but at what point do we do towing? I have an issue with they pay their 3 fines and we clear the slate and we start all over again. In that particular case, the person's spouse came down and paid it so that they weren't in arrears. But we have to have something in there that says, this is a repeat offender, they're gonna be towed, and that's part of the discussion. Has that been put into here?
There is some discussion about at what point and some recommendations for changing ordinance language. I think depending on the level of the offense, it's a 3 strikes or 4 strikes recommendation. So after the third violation or the 4th violation, it's an automatic towing violation thereafter. With the example that you're giving, I think there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, why is there a tractor trailer parked curbside in this particular area? And that goes to some degree to this question of rules making and policy making. Why isn't something like that already on the books? If something's not already on the books, what's the process we've got to go through in order to get something on the books to address that particular situation? So there's a lot to unpack there. On your question of repeat violations, within the report you will see a section that talks specifically about recommendations for an automatic conversion over to towing after X number of violations, rather than the ability to go on and on and on. Now, part of the issue that you're describing though is they've acquired 3 violations, but then they pay the 3 violations.
So there's no 3 strikes hanging on the books. Nothing's in arrears. And, Ms. Stanfield was kind of hands tied as to what we could do. It has stopped, that particular practice has stopped, but it was ongoing for quite a while. And it was in a school zone. It was a nightmare to the residents and to everything. And there was little we could do. I can't even imagine what the towing would be of a tractor trailer. Of something like that. But that's just an extreme example, but that's why I'd like to see a towing element put into this. And not that I want residents towed, but that is an issue. May I continue, Mr. Chairman?
Pardon?
May I continue with some of my questions? One of the other thing is Manchester, I think it's a Victory Street parking garage, they go till 8 p.m. And that's used quite often for the Palace Theater, the Rex Theater, and so on, knowing that people are going to be there later. So I really wouldn't want to see us go beyond the 9 p.m., but that's just my opinion. We're doing leasing now already in our parking garages and so on. If we added to that, if we increase the amount of leases and so on, are we kind of shooting ourselves in the foot? And I'm going to give you an example. Recently, I was in Concord, and I was trying to find parking because I had to go into the State House. I didn't know how long I was going to be in there. And I didn't want that, just a 2-hour limit, so I couldn't park on Main Street there. I had to find a parking, and it was difficult finding a parking garage that had an empty space because the majority of the spaces were leased.
Yes.
And then that became a nightmare. So when we're talking about doing leases, are we going to put a limit as to how many leases we will give out? Because we need to have the parking for, and I'm not just talking about nighttime, I'm talking about during the daytime. If we're trying to keep people off Main Street, we need to be able to have this. So would you recommend also limiting the number of leases we give out?
Yes.
Okay, good. I really wanted to hear that. And I just want to add to, I think if we go beyond the 9 o'clock, even going to 9 o'clock, some of the restaurants might be a little upset. I mean, they want to get turnover too because they want to get people in there, but we're actually putting it till many of them are closing at 10 or 11 o'clock.
If I can, on that last one, the biggest issue that you've got when you roll back the hours of enforcement, the people who most benefit, you're right, the restaurants are going to be upset, but I think the restaurants are going to be upset because their staff are going to be yelling at them. Because with the 7 o'clock cutoff you've got right now at the 90 minutes here, if somebody's coming on shift at 4, they go out, they feed the meters once, that'll take them till 5:30. They take a break at that point on, they come out, they feed the meter again, that takes them till 7. If they manage to occupy that space without drawing a ticket, they can stay there the rest of the night at this point, and the space never turns over. Taking it to 9 o'clock just makes that practice a little bit more difficult as far as that goes. And creates a little bit more of a disincentive for that type of behavior, as does increasing the cost of doing that. Getting even more enforcement out there and maybe changing the ordinance on the books to say that you can't shuffle vehicles within a particular area will cut down that as well. You're still gonna have those behaviors, but the more obstacles we put into action there, the less likely you're gonna see that kind of abuse. And that's usually the abuse that's happening. When people come into the restaurant at 8 o'clock at night and say, I had to park around the corner and down the street, 9 times out of 10, I can tell you the reason that they're doing that is because many of the employees that work there have brought their car up closer so that when they close out at midnight, they walk out the door and it's right there. And because there's no enforcement after the cutoff, they can do that without penalty.
That's one of the nice things about electronic, you have to move your vehicle, because it times out. Thank you so much.
Okay. Anybody else? Alderman Moore.
I just have one question. Thank you for the presentation, I appreciate it. When it comes to expanding the parking department and adding all these FTEs and other positions, is it cost effective to, contract out to like last parking and have them pick up fringe or anything like that?
There are municipalities that subcontract portions of their operation out. Lowell still has a lot of garages that are attended pay at exit. They contract all of that labor as well as all of the labor to maintain those lots and garages out to last parking in order to do that. The thing that you've always got to, there's a couple things you've got to weigh off here in terms of cost benefit. One is whatever savings you're going to have in terms of, what you're not going to be paying in benefits because it's a private contract employee rather than a public employee here. You've got to offset that against whatever you're going to have to pay for management fee to the parking operator. In some cases, especially in the major municipalities like in Ann Arbor or in Albany, or even Lowell to some degree, it makes sense to subcontract, even though you're going to have higher turnover if you've got a private operator in there, because they're not offering the same type of benefits or pay scale that the public is, because they have a large labor pool to draw from. I would be concerned in Nashua that there isn't necessarily that same broad labor pool to draw from. So if you brought an operator in to take over a lot of this stuff, you may be trading one set of costs for another. And I don't know, I'd have to study that one to figure out if there's a way that pencils out and makes more sense. I certainly understand the benefit of subcontracting that stuff out. I just can tell you from experience, once you get to a certain size of operation, it becomes much more problematical and it solves far fewer issues than if you are a larger operation. Like I said, Ann Arbor, Albany, Rochester, New York, they make very effective use of subcontracting certain aspects of maintenance and operations out to third parties because of the size of the staffing requirement they've got and the ability of that contractor to replace staff, if you will, as they roll through. And I don't know that you would have those same benefits at an operation of this size. I think that's why Portsmouth, Concord, and Manchester are mostly kept it in-house today.
Thank you. Is it worth even drawing maybe to Director Cummings? This is what it would cost in-house, this would cost to contract. I know in the business I run, that's something I have to balance every day. Who am I going to contract things out to or who are going to do in-house? Because of that exact same thing, who can do it cheaper?
Director Cummings.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's something that should be studied. I think it's an exercise just so we can come back to you in good faith and say we've looked at it and can tell you what the pros and cons are, and then you can make a decision as to which direction you want to go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, again, Mr. Hill, thank you very much. It is snowing out there, according to the weather hawk, my wife herself. Nashua has declared a 2-hour delay as of this time for openings. But we do have one more item on the agenda. Do you want your thumb drive?
Please.
Yes. Can you pass it to him? When you have a chance. Okay, that being said, and again, thank you, Mr. Hill, and I think we're gonna have to rely on your expertise at a later date on this. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
But thank you so much. Okay, we're gonna get back to the original infrastructure agenda, and that's gonna be unfinished business, and I think, Alderman Como, did you have your motion that you would
Yes, Mr.
kindly withdrew and like to bring it forward?
I would like to, Mr. Chair. I wonder if, before I do that, if I could ask Director Cummings a question? If that's all right.
Sure.
In reading the communication you sent on this, I just want to make sure I'm clear in what it is that you're looking for. There's no legislation to recommend final passage on. You're just looking for our kind of agreement that we want BIDA to submit legislation? Is that correct?
That's a more accurate statement, yes,
So-
if I may.
Why don't you read the motion, then we
So
can discuss.
I've rewritten my motion to no longer say it's recommending final passage, and if it's all right with you,
That's
Mr.
correct.
Chair, I would like to make a motion that the joint Planning and Economic Development and Infrastructure Committees authorize BIDA to submit legislation to the Board of Aldermen relative to the potential acquisition and development of lots 77-3 and 77-8.
Thank you, that's exactly right, Mr. Chairman. And if you could be so kind, I actually pulled up the GIS on your screen there, and if you were to just go to those specific parcels, I'm not sure if you can do that, or I can certainly pull it up. Yep, there we go.
Close.
Yep, keep going.
Red Street, Pine Street, Meadow Street, there we go.
Yep, nope,
yep.
back down. You're headed in the right direction.
Yeah,
Yep, there you go.
yeah.
That's it, right there.
This guy right here.
Yes,
Right
that's
there,
right.
yeah.
So that parcel in particular is the parcel of interest that BIDA has expressed an interest in developing as a future project. As some of you may or may not know, BIDA here in Nashua really was the driving force behind what we called at the time the Renaissance projects down over on the Hudson line. At the time, and this was a project that they worked on for a good 15 or so years. And so early on, there was a vision of about 800 units of housing going in on that land. As time went on, as the vision got more defined, you know, we have 156 units currently out there. There's another 160 units actually to be constructed starting this spring. But that's really going to bring that project to fruition. And so now they're looking to do something with the momentum that they've built. And so what they've really focused in on is on this parcel, with the thought processes that this could be an affordable housing type of project that they would pursue, a multifamily affordable housing. Obviously, it's constrained by the land. So, you know, it's not going to be a terribly big project per se. But it is something that they would be looking to pursue. And what they would be looking to do is, if the Board of Aldermen and the mayor were willing to grant them the, you know, this you know, basically partnership with them, they wanted to use some of their $250,000 that they've set aside, which they obtained through the Renaissance project, to start doing some of the due diligence and some of the design and basically bring the project to a point where they could sell it, and they could sell it for a return. And again, they would be looking to have that same type of split that they had with the Renaissance project, where they would, you know, keep some of the money, put it into the trust fund so they could do another project similar to this. And then the city would keep some of the funding and obviously the tax benefit that occurs by doing this type of redevelopment. I'm specifically focusing on this parcel here because it's the primary parcel. I would be remiss not to point out that yes, they have also discussed this idea of just this other parcel right here that they would like to also, study. I wouldn't suggest that they would develop it in its entirety, but it is a rather large parking lot. In their opinion, it is not utilized to its maximum benefit. So could you maybe straighten out one of those red lines, square it off a little bit, give some additional land to the parcel just to the south of it, which may create a little bit more of a development site. It's that type of analysis that they wanted to kind of go through. So that's why these two particular parcels are mentioned. I don't want to misrepresent anything and to say that this parking lot would be developed in its entirety, because I think that would cause some concerns for some abutters in the neighborhood. But this is a conversation at hand, and something that I would want to put on the table for discussion. Could it be developed in a way where it preserves the parking underneath and you go vertical above? Maybe. But nothing has obviously been designed. And so before we go down the path too much further, I wanted to just bring it to your attention, get your sense, get your comments. I'd like to go back to BIDA, represent what your feelings may be. And if there is a consensus on this and there's an appetite, the next step would be to file legislation. And so anyway, I'll leave my comments there, but I did want to have this type of discussion with this body.
Yeah, I would just like to say, Director Cummings, you didn't really get into the current history or the past history. The building that exists right now is underneath the National Police Department. They have used it for training. With the upcoming new opening of the Public Works Building, Administration Building, at the Fort Hills landfill, that their existing offices on Riverside Drive just happens to be strategically located next to the police station and can go hand in hand with the police department's needs. Also, keeping in mind for that building, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but some of the other tenants that are there, such as the cable network and everything, is still staying. But that means they're going to vacate this particular property. So that's why it's coming to this particular board, because it's going to be up to infrastructure what we want to do. Once an entity is done with the property, it gets referred back to infrastructure. So that's the level we're at. Did I say it correctly?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Yep.
So that's why we're here. Okay. Alderman Como.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say briefly, Alderman Sullivan and I sit on BIDA, and I think that it was universally, it was pretty much unanimously approved by the BIDA. It's a good site. We're pretty excited about what potential we could bring to it. So I'm excited to see what BIDA comes up with. So I hope that we can continue moving this along. Thank you.
Okay, further discussion by the committee? Alderman Jettie.
Thank you. So, I'm all in favor of, allowing BIDA to develop or try to find a developer who is interested in the property and selling it. And, I question whether, multifamily use is the right use for this area, but I'll leave that up to them. They're more expert in this stuff than I am. But one of the provisions that kind of bothers me, it bothered me in the Renaissance project, is that, they're asking to, split the profits. So I looked at, the value, this building is assessed, or this land and building is assessed at $583,000. So I'm assuming that it would be sold for at least that. so that would give them, 300,000. I mean, I don't know the answer to this, but my question for you, I'd be interested in your answer and what other people think. It would seem to me that it would be better for bidder to come to us and say, we want, 100,000 or 250,000 to, to put in this fund and to enable us to, to pay expenses in the development of property and looking for opportunities to utilize city-owned land, for, to sell it and for, whatever purposes. It would seem, I would feel more comfortable if they came to us and say, well, we need X amount of dollars to do this. Rather than, say that, we're gonna split the, give them half the profit of the sale of this thing, without, without their justifying what they're gonna do with the money. They've got 250,000 now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much they're gonna spend on developing this, and so after, so I'm thinking, well, great, let them use the money they have to develop this, and then after they sell it, say, okay, we wanna move on to another project, and, we've got, 100,000 left, we need another 150, or we've got 75 left, we need, X amount.
Yeah.
So, do you understand my thinking?
I do.
Okay, so what helped me to figure that out?
I think to some degree, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
It's philosophical. I mean, it's relative to your values and how you perceive it. And I'm getting a sense, it's also about a sense of control and where you'd prefer the money to come in and not necessarily have this type of conversation in advance. As someone who works with BIDA regularly and someone who works with a lot of community groups regularly, they want to have some skin in the game. They want to have some participation. They want to know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So they're looking for how they can structure it that also helps them. And I see them having these types of conversations as a group, and so and it's how they get their motivation to proceed. And so that's a little bit more of a psychological type of response. But what I know is there's the political and the governmental reality of the situation that if you go down the route that maybe you're suggesting, there will always be this political dynamic that comes up where it's like, well, this is a choice. We could spend it here, or do we spend it on more operational needs like a salaries? And you're then not gonna have a little nest egg to be able to do this type of redevelopment. So as an urban planner, the reason why I would recommend this approach to you is because what BIDA is really trying to do is they're trying to build a little nest egg for themselves so they can ultimately do much bigger projects, but they're working with the budget that they have right now. That was one of their, thoughts for selecting this particular site. But ultimately, it is money that is not taxpayer-generated money, but actually money that comes from the proceeds of a sale of an asset that the city owns, yes, but it wasn't necessarily taxpayer-generated revenue, and therefore they can use it to be a catalyst for actually spurring wealth for the community by reinvesting that money into another capital asset that hopefully improves the value, and you can do this in a way that becomes almost like a cycle, and you hopefully grow it over time.
Okay. Alderman Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks.
And my question is to the other property, the one that's basically a parking lot. And I know that's really not so much on the table other than it's an idea that they might have. You did say that some of the abutters might have an issue with it. Is it because that they're using, like when I look at the GIS, I see cars in that parking lot. I'm assuming that these businesses are using that parking lot for themselves, for their businesses, employees, et cetera. Is developing this could become an issue in that respect, is that correct?
Well, this parking lot, if I may, Mr. Chairman, is going to be a topic of conversation at some point over the next 6 months or so. As you just heard in the parking study, and I knew this was inevitably gonna come about, this is a city-owned asset where the city doesn't obtain any revenue off of it. So whether you keep it as a parking lot, and I think you know, from an urban planning perspective, I would recommend preserving the parking there. But giving it away for free is something I wouldn't recommend doing. So charging for parking in and of itself is gonna be a conversation that I think the Board of Aldermen is gonna need to have. That is gonna be a cultural shift that the abutters are not gonna like anyway. Compounding that situation is now you have this group of folks who wanna redevelop, and I think some misinformation could get out very easily where some of the abutters will say the city, or specifically Tim Cummings, is trying to take away our parking lot. And I fully expect that conversation will come about.
It's already on Facebook.
Excellent.
Boy, you're fast.
I just posted it. It was me.
And I just think I think it would be good for Beta to hear what the parameters are that the Board of Aldermen have if you were even to grant them this type of privilege. And so I am trying to tease this out so you can think strategically and say yes or no. And if it's yes, it's under these types of conditions. And again, one of them may be, you know, we want to make sure we don't negatively impact your abutters who use this parking lot. So, you know, that may in and of itself mean that you can only use it minimally. Or you may say, if you can, and I'm making this up, if you can figure this out like the way the School Street lot was figured out, where we preserved the public parking on the ground floor and we were to build above it and you were to build apartments on top of that parking lot and not negatively impact your abutters, we're okay with that too. Now again, that's a pretty extreme statement that I just made, but it's really a conversation as to how much development you really want to see on site. I can tell you that site is a great development site for multifamily housing. Multifamily housing is the way this neighborhood is going to trend. That's just a fact. And so, you know, if you want to use it in a way like that, then you're going to be looking at the parcel to the south much differently. And you're really going to want to think through how these two lots work together if you're even going to be open to that type of conversation.
Right, just.
Alderman Clay.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up the comment about the possibly charging for it, because as I was sitting here looking at all these, thinking this is a city-owned property, and people just, I walk through there all the time when I go through Mine Falls, when I come up through that area and so on. And then when I looked, I know here we've just got it this, but if we had changed the layers to the aerial parcel view, you could see the property, and I know we have a lot of homeless people living in there. Yeah, up one more, no, up to, no, go to the top, right there, yeah, and choose parcel with aerials. Yeah, so you can see that where that little building is, and that it's, I walk through here all the time, doing the loop of Mine Falls and so on. And there's always cars in that parking lot. That little space on the bottom just looks like it's too small just for housing, and having walked through there and so on, I would think that they're gonna need the other, that it's gonna be flipped, that would be the housing and then parking. Just my opinion, yeah.
Director Cummings.
I don't know until we actually start getting some architectural design done, some civil engineering design done to know what really could be laid out on it. And again, it's going to be a conversation of how much parking do you want to provide on site. We just heard a consultant tell us that we should be starting to provide parking on site as part of the development. That will back into the equation. But assuming that we provide a 1 or a 1.5 parking spaces per unit, I would think you could probably fit 30 to 40 units on that parcel. And I completely agree, you're not gonna see a 120 unit project, but I think you could see what would be referred to as a middle tier or a mid-rise type of structure. It's really gonna be dependent on the amount of parking you wanna put on it. Now, if you're willing to use some of that parking, and let's say we do no development on that parcel and we preserve it as a surface parking lot only, and you were to develop a public-private partnership where you offloaded your parking into that parking lot, which again is a good complementary use, because I could only imagine that that parking lot is 100% empty at night, you then would maximize the units. And then you could build more on that parcel.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have Alderman Clements and Alderman Theobald.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I guess I'm just interested to see what they come back with. I would, if you're asking, I guess I would want to make sure that there is enough parking spaces for the people who utilize the parking lot now. And I always would have that preference, because I don't like the idea of forcing people out of the situation that they're in. So, you know, I think that needs to be a priority, but other than that, I mean, if they can figure it out to do that in some other way, however they want to do it, I think that that's fine. The only other thing is and I mentioned this before, and I don't know if it would affect that portion of it or not, but with that other development that we were talking about, which is on the other side of this, again, whatever they do with that lot, I would just want to make sure that if there's a need for truck access to any of those buildings, that be maintained.
Understood.
Okay, good. Alderman Theobald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Alderman Jettie kind of convinced me to his comments for how I'm going to vote on this. My question to the chair, to Director Cummings, is there any chance that this is going to be, the lot we're talking about specifically, going to be low rent, not affordable, but low rent housing of any sort?
Dr. Cummings.
Define low rent.
Well-
Define median. I think what you're asking is median area income. And I think what you're asking is, will it be median area income between the 40 and 60% range?
Yeah, I want it under affordable. So because we throw that word out on basically everything, even if it's
Yeah.
200,000, we're saying, oh, well, that's affordable to some people. I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about free either, but, you know, something under the affordable tier that we always talk about.
Okay.
And I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. So we in Nashua, for specifically our inclusionary ordinance, define affordable at 80% of AMI to 100% of AMI. I think I can answer your question now with more confidence that BITA hasn't had this conversation specifically, but the way I've heard them talk is they're thinking of this being a LIHTC project, which would put them in that 40 to 60% AMI range.
Okay, Alderman Moore.
Would that mean someone could show up with a Section 8 voucher and basically have their rent covered and maybe have to pay a couple $100?
Yeah, yes.
Anybody else? Alderman GOV.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think this is a good project and a good endeavor to look at more in depth. I think there's a lot of questions that need to be asked, but on its face, I think it's looking at this plot of land. If somebody thinks they can do better than what it is now, then all for it. But I think obviously parking is could be a big issue, but could be solved pretty easily at the same time. But if somebody wants to develop this into something better, then I have no issue with it. Have at it.
Anybody else? Alderman Clements. Excuse me, Director Clements. God, Clements.
Director.
Cummings.
Alike.
The hour is late.
It is the
Oh, I know,
You just had a
I,
beard.
You've been
I
in
know,
Congress.
Couldn't tell the difference.
I've been legislating for 12 and a half hours right now.
So, Mr. Chairman, I just kind of want to summarize. I mean, this is really important for me to make sure I get accurate. And so I'm hearing that there is an appetite to develop. I'm hearing that legislation could be forthcoming that sets out this type of arrangement. Understanding that multifamily is most likely the use that will happen, but maybe not if there's another use that makes sense. but particularly an affordable housing component is really what you're looking for. And that affordable housing component of 40 to 60% of AMI. And understanding we need to preserve the public parking that's available to the abutters in some way. Is that?
Okay, anybody else? Alderman Jettie?
Yeah, I don't know how other people feel, but I would not be in favor of splitting the proceeds with Bidder. I think, I'm happy to support Bidder, but I think I would rather they come to us and say, out of that 250 that they've got now, they've spent X amount and they need X amount more for another project. I would be happy to entertain that, but to split the proceeds from the sale of this property, I would not be in favor of that.
Director Cummings?
That's a fundamental tenet that Bidder has that they want, that they're gonna want. So I just need this group to understand that.
And could I?
Follow up?
So, as I understand it, Bidder is a committee formed by the Board of Aldermen. They're volunteers, but they belong to a committee for the purpose of, seeking development opportunities. I'm surprised that you would say to us that, they require that we split the proceeds of this, or they're not going to do anything. I mean, is that true? Do you really mean that?
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, you may.
I can't say whether they're going to or not going to, but what I can represent to you is it's a fundamental tenet that has been part of their conversations from the beginning, and they are not a committee of the city of Nashua. They're technically an authority, and they do want to do redevelopment, but I think that they want to make sure they fundamentally understand the business deal, if you will, the business terms with moving forward, so they kind of have an understanding as to what their role and function is.
Alderman Clemmons?
I don't know where else we can get AMI 40% done at a cost that basically allows us to split profits. So for me, yeah, I'm fine with it.
Yeah. Alderman Como?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to point out, I don't feel like this agreement is that unusual. I think maybe the only unusual thing about it is that it's a percentage and not a flat dollar amount. But we just, a week ago, agreed to fund the Downtown Improvement Committee, and we don't make them come to us with a list of potential expenditures and requests for money. We basically said, here's your funding, go do the thing that you're chartered to do. This is really no different, except that it's a percentage instead of a flat dollar amount, which gives them the incentive to do bigger things that will generate more money for both them and for the city. Like Director Cummings said, it's kind of an escalation, but it's no different than the way we fund lots of different things. We don't make everybody come to us with a list of requisitions. I think this is, it's not a problem for me to do it this way.
Okay, yes, Director Cummings?
And I want to clarify that I'm going to redo the math on this so it emulates exactly what the Renaissance project was, but essentially I believe it was a third split. So Bidder kept $250,000, but I believe the sale of the land was somewhere in the $750,000 range for the Renaissance project. And so I'll double check what the percentage split was, but I want to say that, essentially they're looking to keep a third of whatever the sale price is, to stay true with how it was done with the Renaissance project.
Alderman Theobald?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It may end up being like the Downtown Improvement Committee, but through you to Alderman Como, you voted against the Downtown Improvement Committee. So is it the same or is it not the same? Because I'm thinking I'm going to vote against this.
Can I respond to that?
You may respond.
I do agree that it's the same, but I disagree with the purpose of the two committees. So that's why I can in good conscience vote against one and vote for the other.
Thank you.
Okay, Alderman Moran?
we've talked about this for quite some time, and the hour's late and it's snowing. I motion to move the vote.
To move the question?
Yeah, that's what I meant, sorry.
Okay,
Fresh
we
memory
have a
on the
motion to move the
term.
question. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Nay, who had the nay? Okay, one nay,
2 nays.
2 nays. 2 nays, motion carries. The question has been moved. Seeing now, that means we go back to the original. Can the clerk please read the, what we come to an agreement on?
Absolutely,
the
Mr.
motion?
Chair. My motion was that the joint Planning and Economic and Infrastructure Committees authorize BIDA to submit legislation to the Board of Aldermen relative to the potential acquisition and development of lots 77-3 and 77-8.
Okay, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
The nays?
Nay.
Nay,
We have 1,
2.
2 nays. Okay.
Got it.
Okay, motion carries. That, believe it or not, that concludes the business of the committee this evening. Nice job, everybody, you know. And hope everybody's safe with the upcoming storm. I will now look for public comments, seeing nobody in the audience. We'll open and close public comments. Remarks from Alderman. Alderman Moran.
I just want to clarify, you guys already voted on the stop sign for Topaz Street?
Yes.
Yes, so I would like to say I apologize for not being able to have a conversation about it. I had to take a call from a patient who was in crisis, but I just wanted to say I sat at that intersection for quite some time, and it was very dangerous as a school bus stop. I'm glad that the committee voted to support it. So thank you guys for putting that stop sign up. And also, I just learned that my daughter's still awake and watching this for some reason. So Summer, please go to bed.
I'll have you know the stop sign went through
Great.
without any stops.
Stop.
No problem. Alderman Como.
Yes, thank you. Because I'm such an exceptional clerk, I would like to make a motion to accept the parking plan presentation into the record
Yes,
and place
Mr.
it on file.
Very good. And you do have a copy for
I do.
administrative clerk? Very good. Without objection, I'll accept the downtown parking plan, Board of Aldermen briefing submitted by Mr. Andy Hill for Desmond Associates. Okay. Any other discussion by Alderman? Seeing none, does, looking for a motion to adjourn. Alderman Como.
I move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn. All right. Thank you very much. I'll declare the meeting adjourned at 10:32. Oh, yeah, yeah. I'm going nuts. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are now adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
10:32.